Deep beneath the surface of a sea that no longer exists, in a world unrecognizable from the one we know, something extraordinary was hunting. It moved through darkness so complete that light had never touched it. It descended past the reach of the sun, past the zones where other predators dared to swim, into a realm of crushing pressure and absolute silence. It was built for a world that would terrify any living creature on Earth today. Its bones were dense as stone. Its eyes were enormous, black, and unblinking, evolved to capture the faintest shimmer of bioluminescence in a world without daylight. Its body was a machine of patience, a predator that did not chase, did not pursue, but simply sank, waited, and struck. It was Abyssosaurus. And for 130 million years, the Earth forgot it ever existed. Until a single skeleton, buried in the limestone of a vanished seabed, now stranded in the heart of landlocked Russia, whispered its secret to the handful of scientists willing to listen. This is the story of that creature. This is the story of a predator that solved the same impossible problem that modern sperm whales would not face for another 100 million years. This is the story of convergent evolution, of deep time, of scientific detective work that spanned decades, and of the profound, almost philosophical truth that the fossil record is not a library. It is not a complete archive. It is a lottery. An Abyssosaurus, against all conceivable odds, won. Please let us know in the comments where you are watching this history video and what time you are watching it. And be sure to subscribe to the channel for future videos. To understand Abyssosaurus, we first have to understand the world it lived in. And that means we have to go back. Not thousands of years. Not millions of years. We have to go back 130 million years, to a period of Earth's history known as the Early Cretaceous. And when we arrive there, we will find a planet that looks almost nothing like the one we currently inhabit. The continents were not where they are now. The climate was not what it is now. The oceans were not what they are now. The very atmosphere was different, richer in carbon dioxide, warmer on average, and lacking the polar ice caps that define so much of our modern world's geography and weather patterns. If you could somehow be transported to the early Cretaceous, you would step out onto a world that felt alien in almost every conceivable way, and yet, paradoxically, it was this same planet, this same spinning ball of rock and iron and water, just caught at a different moment in its incomprehensibly long biography. The early Cretaceous is part of the Mesozoic era, that grand stretch of geological time often called, with some justification, the age of reptiles. The dinosaurs ruled the land. Pterosaurs owned the skies. And in the oceans, a dazzling and terrifying array of marine reptiles had diversified into every conceivable ecological niche. The seas of the early Cretaceous were not empty expanses of blue water. They were ecosystems as complex, as layered, and as ruthlessly competitive as any modern ocean, and in many ways, they were more dangerous. But to truly set the stage for our story, we need to talk about one ocean in particular. An ocean that has no modern equivalent. An ocean that has been erased from the face of the earth so completely that its very existence seems almost mythological. We need to talk about the Tethys Sea. The Tethys Sea. Say the name aloud and it sounds like something from legend, something a poet would invent. And in a way, that is fitting because the Tethys was named after a figure from Greek mythology, the Titaness Tethys, sister and wife of Oceanus, the great river that the ancient Greeks believed encircled the world. The geological Tethys was not a river, of course. It was a sea. An enormous, warm, shallow to moderately deep body of water that stretched across what is now southern Europe, the Middle East, Central Asia, and parts of North Africa. It was, in many ways, the Mediterranean Sea's ancient ancestor, though it was vastly larger, vastly warmer, and vastly more biologically productive than the Mediterranean we know today. The Tethys Sea existed because the continents were arranged differently. During the early Cretaceous, the ancient supercontinent of Pangaea had already begun to break apart, but the process was far from complete. The northern landmass, Laurasia, and the southern landmass, Gondwana, were separated by this great east-west seaway, the Tethys, which allowed warm equatorial currents to circulate freely around much of the globe. This had profound implications for climate. The Tethys acted as a kind of planetary heat distributor, spreading warm water from the tropics into higher latitudes, moderating temperatures, and creating conditions that were, on the whole, much warmer and much more uniform than what we experience today. The waters of the Tethys were warm. In many places they were shallow, covering vast continental shelves with sunlit seas that teemed with life. Coral reefs flourished. Ammonites, those coiled-shelled relatives of modern squid and nautiluses, were everywhere, their fossils so abundant in Tethyan sediments that they serve as some of the most important index fossils for dating Cretaceous rocks. Fish of every description swam through these waters. Sharks, some of them quite large, patrolled the upper layers. And ruling over all of this, at the very top of the food chain, were the marine reptiles. Now, when most people think of marine reptiles from the age of dinosaurs, they tend to think of a few charismatic groups. They think of the ichthyosaurs, those dolphin-shaped speedsters that had dominated the oceans during the earlier Triassic and Jurassic periods. They think of the mosasaurs, those massive, monitor lizard-like predators that would come to dominate the late Cretaceous seas. And they think of the plesiosaurs. The plesiosaurs are central to our story. Abyssosaurus was a plesiosaur. But to say that is a bit like saying a sperm whale is a mammal. It is true, but it tells you almost nothing about what made the animal special. Because the plesiosaurs were not a single type of animal. They were an entire order of marine reptiles, a sprawling family tree that encompassed an astonishing range of body types, feeding strategies, and ecological roles. And understanding that diversity is essential to understanding why Abyssosaurus was so remarkable. The plesiosaurs first appeared in the fossil record during the late Triassic period, roughly 210 million years ago, and they persisted all the way to the end of the Cretaceous, 66 million years ago, when the asteroid impact that wiped out the non-avian dinosaurs also brought the curtain down on the plesiosaurs, the mosasaurs, the pterosaurs, and so many other lineages. That is a span of nearly 150 million years. To put that in perspective, the entire history of modern humans, from the first anatomically modern Homo sapiens to the present day, covers roughly 300,000 years. The plesiosaurs endured for 500 times longer than our species has existed. They had time to evolve. They had time to diversify. And diversify they did. The plesiosaurs are traditionally divided into two major groups, and this division is based on one of the most visually obvious differences in body plan you could imagine. On one hand, you have the plesiosauromorphs, the classic long-necked plesiosaurs. These are the animals that gave rise to the popular image of the Loch Ness Monster, with their small heads, absurdly elongated necks, broad bodies, and four paddle-like flippers. Some of the most extreme members of this group, like Elasmosaurus, had necks that contained over 70 vertebrae and stretched to lengths of over 7 meters, longer than the rest of the animal's body combined. These long-necked forms were generally thought to be relatively slow swimmers that used their extraordinary necks to ambush fish, sweeping their small heads through schools of prey with a quick lateral strike, much like a heron does today. On the other hand, you have the pliosauromorphs, or pliosaurs. These were the opposite end of the spectrum. Short necks, massive heads, powerful jaws, enormous bodies. The pliosaurs were the apex predators of the Mesozoic seas, the equivalents of today's great white sharks and orcas, but often much, much larger. Animals like Liopleurodon and Kronosaurus were true sea monsters, reaching lengths of 10 meters or more, with skulls that could be 2 meters long and jaws lined with conical, interlocking teeth designed for seizing and crushing large prey. The pliosaurs were built for power. They were pursuit predators, capable of rapid acceleration, and they fed on other marine reptiles, large fish, and anything else unlucky enough to cross their path. Now, this traditional division, long-necked versus short-necked, surface ambusher versus apex pursuit predator, is useful as a general framework, but like all neat classifications in biology, it is an oversimplification. The real picture was far more complex. Within both the plesiosauromorph and pliosauromorph lineages, there was an enormous amount of variation. Some long-necked forms developed larger heads and more robust jaws. Some short-necked forms became relatively small and specialized. The family tree of the plesiosaurs was a tangled, branching thing, full of side paths and dead ends and experimental body plans that flourished for a time and then vanished. And this is where Abyssosaurus enters the picture. Because Abyssosaurus was a plesiosaur that did something that, as far as we know, no other plesiosaur ever did. It went deep. Let that sink in for a moment. Pun intended, perhaps, but the significance cannot be overstated. For 150 million years, the plesiosaurs were primarily animals of the upper ocean. They were air breathers, remember. Like all marine reptiles, they had to return to the surface to breathe. Their entire body plan, those four broad flippers, that relatively rigid torso, was optimized for efficient cruising through the upper water column, where light penetrated, where prey was abundant, and where the surface was never far away. The plesiosaurs were creatures of the photic zone, the sunlit layer of the ocean. That was their world. That was what they were built for. And then, in the early Cretaceous, in the warm waters of the Tethys Sea, one lineage of plesiosaurs broke the rules. One lineage looked down into the darkness below and, over millions of years of incremental evolutionary change, began to descend. We do not know exactly why. We can speculate, and we will. But the why is, in some ways, less important than the how. Because the how is written in the bones. The how is preserved in the single, precious skeleton that was pulled from the limestone of what is now the Chuvashia region of Russia. The how is what makes Abyssosaurus one of the most remarkable animals in the entire fossil record. But before we get to the skeleton, before we get to the bones and what they tell us, we need to understand something about the deep ocean. We need to understand what it means, physically and biologically, to be a creature of the abyss. The ocean is not uniform. It is layered. If you could somehow drain the water from the ocean basins, you would see a world of mountains and valleys, plains and trenches, but even with the water in place, the ocean is divided into distinct zones, each with its own characteristics, its own challenges, and its own inhabitants. These zones are defined primarily by two things, light and pressure. The uppermost layer of the ocean, the epipelagic zone, extends from the surface down to about 200 meters. This is the sunlit zone, the euphotic zone, the place where photosynthesis is possible, where phytoplankton bloom, where the food chain begins. This is the zone where most of the ocean's visible life exists, the coral reefs, the schools of fish, the whales and dolphins and sea turtles. This is the zone where the plesiosaurs, by and large, made their living. Below the epipelagic lies the mesopelagic zone, the twilight zone, extending from 200 meters to about 1,000 meters. Light still penetrates here, but only barely, and only the shortest wavelengths, the blues and violets. Photosynthesis is not possible. The water is cooler, the pressure is greater, and the animals that live here are strange, many of them equipped with bioluminescent organs, the ability to produce their own light in the gathering darkness. The mesopelagic is a zone of transition, a place where the familiar begins to give way to the alien. Below the mesopelagic is the bathopelagic zone, the midnight zone, from 1,000 to 4,000 meters. Here, there is no light at all. Not a photon of sunlight reaches this depth. The water is cold, just a few degrees above freezing in most of the modern ocean, though in the warmer Cretaceous, deep water temperatures would have been somewhat higher. The pressure is immense. At 1,000 meters, the pressure is 100 times what it is at the surface. At 4,000 meters, it is 400 times. Animals that live here must have bodies that can withstand this crushing force. They are often small, slow-moving, and energy-efficient, because food is scarce at these depths. Most of the nutrition in the deep ocean comes from above, from the constant rain of organic matter, dead plankton, fecal pellets, and the occasional carcass of a larger animal that sinks from the productive surface layers. Marine biologists call this marine snow, and it is the foundation of the deep-sea food web. Below the bathopelagic is the abyssopelagic zone, the abyssal zone, from 4,000 to 6,000 meters. This is the zone that gives Abyssosaurus its name. The abyss. The word comes from the Greek abyssos, meaning bottomless, and while the abyssal zone is not literally bottomless, it might as well be. It is a world of absolute darkness, near freezing temperatures, and pressures that would crush a human body like a soda can. The animals that live here are among the least studied and least understood creatures on Earth, even today. In the Cretaceous, this zone would have been even more mysterious, populated by organisms that left little or no fossil record. And below even the abyssal zone, in the deepest ocean trenches, lies the hadopelagic zone, the Hadal zone, named after Hades, the Greek god of the underworld. But that is deeper than even Abyssosaurus is thought to have ventured. The point of this vertical tour of the ocean is simple. Going deep is hard. Going deep requires specific adaptations. Going deep means solving a series of engineering problems that are fundamentally different from the problems faced by surface-dwelling animals. And every single one of those problems left its mark on the skeleton of Abyssosaurus. The first problem is buoyancy. At the surface, an air-breathing marine animal faces the constant challenge of staying submerged. Air in the lungs provides buoyancy, and the animal must actively swim downward to counteract it. For a surface-dwelling predator, this is manageable. A brief dive to catch a fish, a quick descent to avoid a predator, these require only temporary solutions, a powerful stroke of the flippers, a brief exhalation. But for an animal that wants to reach the deep ocean, buoyancy becomes a serious obstacle. The deeper you go, the more the air in your lungs compresses, and the less buoyancy it provides, which actually helps. But the initial descent, fighting against the buoyancy of a lungful of air, is energetically expensive. One solution is to have a body that is naturally less buoyant. And how do you achieve that? One way is to have dense bones. The second problem is pressure. As we have discussed, pressure increases enormously with depth. For an air-breathing animal, this means that any air spaces in the body, the lungs, the sinuses, the middle ear, are compressed. Modern deep-diving mammals like sperm whales have evolved a suite of adaptations to deal with this: collapsible rib cages that allow the lungs to compress without damage, flexible tracheas, specialized blood chemistry that prevents nitrogen narcosis and decompression sickness. We cannot know with certainty whether Abyssosaurus had all of these soft tissue adaptations, because soft tissue does not fossilize. But we can look at the bones, and the bones tell us something extraordinary. The third problem is oxygen. An air-breathing animal diving deep must carry all of its oxygen with it, stored in the blood and muscles. It cannot breathe at depth. This means that deep-diving animals must have efficient oxygen storage, slow metabolic rates to conserve oxygen, and the ability to tolerate periods of low oxygen in the tissues. Again, these are primarily soft tissue and biochemical adaptations that do not preserve in the fossil record. But we can infer them from the overall body plan, from the animal's size, from the density of its bones, and from comparisons with modern deep-diving species. The fourth problem is finding food. In the deep ocean, prey is scarce and widely dispersed. There are no dense schools of fish, no coral reefs teeming with life. Predators in the deep must either cover vast distances searching for food, or they must be ambush predators, sitting and waiting for prey to come to them. An ambush predation in the dark requires one specific adaptation above all others: the ability to see, or to sense, in the absence of light. Every single one of these challenges is reflected in the anatomy of Abyssosaurus. Every single one of these problems found a solution in this animal's bones. And that is what makes this creature so extraordinary. It is not just a plesiosaur. It is a plesiosaur that reinvented itself, that broke away from the ecological template that had served its relatives for tens of millions of years and carved out a niche that no other plesiosaur, as far as we know, ever occupied. But the story of how we came to understand all of this is itself a remarkable tale. Because the skeleton of Abyssosaurus did not simply emerge from the ground and announce its significance. It spent decades in obscurity. It was misidentified. It was overlooked. It was sitting in a collection waiting, like the creature it represented had once waited in the darkness of the deep ocean, for someone to finally see it for what it was. The year was 1992. The place was the Chuvash Republic, a small autonomous region in the heart of Russia, situated along the Volga River. Chuvashia is landlocked. It is far from any ocean. Its landscape is one of rolling hills, forests, and river valleys. There is nothing about it that immediately suggests the deep sea. And yet, the rocks beneath Chuvashia tell a different story. The geological history of this region is written in limestone. Marine limestone. Rock that was formed on the floor of a shallow to moderately deep sea, built up over millions of years from the accumulated shells and skeletons of countless marine organisms, foraminifera, coccolithophores, brachiopods, the endless rain of calcium carbonate that settled to the bottom of an ancient ocean and was slowly compressed into stone. That ocean was the Tethys. The sea that once covered this part of Russia, connecting the ancient Atlantic to the ancient Pacific, allowing warm currents to flow and marine life to flourish. The Tethys Sea that is now gone, erased by the relentless movement of tectonic plates, by the collision of Africa and India with Eurasia, by the closing of seaways and the uplift of mountain ranges. But the rocks remember. In 1992, a team of Russian paleontologists was working in the limestone deposits of Chuvashia. These deposits had long been known to contain marine fossils from the Cretaceous period, and they had yielded a steady stream of ammonites, belemnites, bivalves, and the occasional vertebrate fossil. The Tethyan sediments of Russia have been a rich source of marine reptile fossils for over a century, and the Chuvashia region was no exception. During this particular field season, the team discovered something significant. A skeleton. Not a complete skeleton, but a substantial portion of one, enough to recognize that it belonged to a large marine reptile. The bones were embedded in the limestone, mineralized, heavy, the color of dark stone. They were clearly old, clearly Cretaceous, and clearly from a plesiosaur of some kind. The discovery was noteworthy, but in the context of Russian paleontology in the early 1990s, it was not immediately earth-shattering. Russia was in the midst of enormous political and economic upheaval. The Soviet Union had just dissolved. Funding for scientific research was scarce. Institutions were struggling to maintain their collections, let alone conduct comprehensive new research. The skeleton from Chuvashia was carefully excavated, prepared to some degree, and placed in a museum collection. It was catalogued. It was described in preliminary terms. And then, for the most part, it was set aside. This is not unusual in paleontology. It happens more often than the public might imagine. Fossils are discovered, excavated, and placed in collections, where they wait, sometimes for years, sometimes for decades, for a researcher with the right expertise, the right questions, and the right funding to give them the attention they deserve. Museum collections around the world are full of specimens that have never been fully described, never been properly studied, never been given the scientific scrutiny that might reveal their true significance. The Abyssosaurus skeleton was one of these. For years, the specimen sat in its collection. It was known to exist. Other researchers were aware of it. But it was not a priority. It was classified, in general terms, as a plesiosaur, and there it sat, one more plesiosaur skeleton among the many that had been recovered from the Tethyan deposits of Russia over the years. The problem was not just a lack of attention. There was also a problem of identification. The skull of the specimen, which is often the most diagnostic element of a fossil, the part that allows researchers to determine exactly what species and what genus they are dealing with, was not immediately recognized for what it was. In some accounts, the skull was misidentified, attributed to a different type of animal, or simply not examined closely enough to reveal its distinctive features. Skulls are delicate structures. They are often the first part of a skeleton to be damaged or destroyed during the process of decay, burial, and fossilization. When they do survive, they can be distorted by the weight of overlying sediment, compressed and deformed in ways that make interpretation difficult. The skull of the Abyssosaurus specimen was not in perfect condition. It was fragmentary, partially crushed, and its most distinctive features, those enormously enlarged eye sockets, that short, triangular profile, were not immediately obvious to researchers who were not specifically looking for them. And so the years passed. The 1990s gave way to the 2000s. Russian paleontology slowly recovered from the funding crises of the post-Soviet era. New researchers entered the field. New techniques became available. And the Chuvashia plesiosaur continued to wait. It is worth pausing here to reflect on the nature of paleontological discovery. We tend to think of fossil discovery as a dramatic event, a moment of revelation in which a skeleton is unearthed, and its significance is immediately apparent. And sometimes it is. Sometimes a fossil is so spectacular, so complete, so obviously novel, that its importance is clear from the moment it emerges from the rock. But more often, the process is slower, messier, and more uncertain. The discovery of a fossil is just the beginning. The real discovery, the scientific discovery, happens later, in the lab, in the museum, in the long hours of careful preparation, measurement, comparison, and analysis that transform a collection of bones into a scientific narrative. In the case of Abyssosaurus, the real discovery would not happen until 2018, more than a quarter of a century after the skeleton was first pulled from the limestone of Chuvashia. And it would happen because of one person, a researcher named Alexander Berezan, who looked at the old bones with fresh eyes and saw something that everyone else had missed. Alexander Berezan was not a household name, even within the relatively small world of paleontology. He was a Russian scientist, a specialist in Mesozoic marine reptiles, and he had spent years working with the collections of fossils that had been accumulated by Russian institutions over the decades. He knew the material. He knew the literature. And he knew that there were specimens in those collections that had never been properly studied. In 2018, Berezan turned his attention to the Chuvashia plesiosaur. We do not know exactly what prompted him to do so. Perhaps it was a systematic review of the collection. Perhaps it was a tip from a colleague. Perhaps it was simply the kind of serendipitous curiosity that drives so much of scientific progress. A researcher who happened to pull the right drawer, open the right box, and notice something that others had overlooked. Whatever the impetus, Berezan began to re-examine the specimen, and what he found astonished him. The skull. It was the skull that told the story. When Berezan carefully re-examined the cranial material, cleaning it, measuring it, comparing it to the skulls of other plesiosaurs in the literature, he realized that this was not an ordinary plesiosaur. The skull was short. Significantly shorter than would be expected for a plesiosaur of this body size. It was triangular in profile, broader at the back and tapering to a relatively blunt snout. This was not the elongated, narrow skull of a typical plesiosauromorph, designed for snapping at small fish. Nor was it the massive, heavily built skull of a pliosaur, designed for seizing and crushing large prey. It was something else. Something different. And then there were the orbits. The eye sockets. They were enormous. Disproportionately large, far larger than those of any plesiosaur of comparable size. In life, these oversized orbits would have housed correspondingly oversized eyes that were evolved for one purpose and one purpose only, to gather as much light as possible in an environment where light was scarce or absent. Large eyes are one of the most reliable indicators of deep water or low light adaptation in the animal kingdom. We see it in modern deep-sea fish, whose eyes can be huge relative to their body size. We see it in nocturnal animals, like owls and tarsiers, whose enormous eyes are adapted for hunting in darkness. We see it in the giant squid, whose basketball-sized eyes, the largest in the animal kingdom, are thought to be adapted for detecting the faint bioluminescent glow of sperm whales descending toward them in the deep ocean. Large eyes mean low light. And low light, in the marine context, means deep water. Berezan recognized this immediately. The oversized orbits of the Chuvashia specimen were not a random variation, not a developmental anomaly, not the result of post-mortem distortion. They were an adaptation. A clear, unambiguous signal that this animal lived and hunted in deep, dark water. But the skull was just the beginning. As Berezan continued his examination, he found that the entire skeleton told the same story. Every element, every bone, every anatomical feature, pointed to the same conclusion: this was a deep-diving plesiosaur. Consider the bones themselves. In most plesiosaurs, the bones are relatively light, with significant internal spaces filled with marrow and fat. This is typical of surface-dwelling marine animals, for whom buoyancy is not a problem, or for whom neutral or positive buoyancy is actually an advantage, making it easier to stay near the surface, where they breathe and where their prey is concentrated. But the bones of the Chuvashia specimen were different. They were dense. Remarkably dense. Abnormally dense, by plesiosaur standards. The long bones, the ribs, the vertebrae, all showed a pattern of increased bone density, a condition known as osteosclerosis. Osteosclerosis. The word comes from the Greek, osteon, meaning bone, and scleros, meaning hard. It describes a condition in which bone tissue becomes unusually dense and heavy, with the internal spaces that would normally be filled with marrow or spongy bone tissue being replaced by compact, solid bone. In pathological contexts, in humans with certain diseases, osteosclerosis can be a problem. But in the context of marine animal evolution, it is an adaptation, a brilliant, elegant solution to the problem of buoyancy. An animal with dense, heavy bones is less buoyant. It sinks more readily. It does not have to expend as much energy fighting its way down against the upward pull of the air in its lungs. For a surface-dwelling animal, this would be a disadvantage, making it harder to stay afloat, harder to breathe, harder to rest at the surface. But for a deep-diving animal, it is a profound advantage. Dense bones act as ballast, helping the animal descend to great depths with minimal effort. The animal can simply relax, exhale, and allow gravity and its own heavy skeleton to carry it down into the deep. We see this exact adaptation in modern deep-diving mammals. Sperm whales have some of the densest bones of any living mammal. Beaked whales, which are among the deepest diving animals alive today, regularly reaching depths of over 2,000 meters, also have exceptionally dense bones. The pattern is consistent across deep diving lineages. Dense bones equal deep diving. And the bones of Abyssosaurus were dense. Berezan documented all of this. He measured the bone density. He measured the orbit size. He examined the proportions of the skull and the postcranial skeleton. And as the data accumulated, a picture began to emerge of an animal unlike any plesiosaur that had ever been described. But science does not move on the strength of a single observation, however striking. Science requires publication. It requires peer review. It requires the systematic presentation of evidence and argument, subjected to the scrutiny of other experts. And the story of Abyssosaurus, in its published form, would unfold slowly, over the course of 3 distinct research papers, published over nearly a decade. The first paper laid the groundwork. It described the specimen in detail, presenting the measurements, the photographs, the diagrams, the careful anatomical descriptions that are the foundation of any new species description in paleontology. The paper named the animal Abyssosaurus, the abyss lizard. The name was chosen deliberately, a declaration of the animal's ecological identity embedded in its very nomenclature. The naming of a new species is not a casual act in paleontology. It follows a strict set of rules, codified in the International Code of Zoological Nomenclature, and it requires the designation of a type specimen, a single, specific fossil that serves as the official reference point for the species. In the case of Abyssosaurus, the type specimen was, by necessity, the only known specimen, the skeleton from Chuvashia. This is not ideal. Paleontologists prefer to have multiple specimens when describing a new species, because a single specimen might not be representative of the species as a whole. It might be an unusually large or unusually small individual. It might have pathological features, bones deformed by disease or injury, that could be mistaken for diagnostic features of the species. A single specimen is a single data point, and single data points are inherently risky in science. But you work with what you have. And what the paleontologists had was this one skeleton, this one collection of dense, dark bones from the limestone of Chuvashia. It would have to be enough. The first paper described the anatomy. The second paper went further, placing Abyssosaurus in its evolutionary context, attempting to determine its precise position on the Plesiosaur family tree. This is the science of phylogenetics, the reconstruction of evolutionary relationships based on shared anatomical features. It is painstaking work, involving the comparison of dozens or hundreds of individual anatomical characters across dozens or hundreds of species, the data typically processed by computer algorithms that search for the family tree that best explains the observed pattern of similarities and differences. The phylogenetic analysis confirmed what the anatomy had suggested. Abyssosaurus was a plesiosaur, but it was not closely related to any of the well-known plesiosaur lineages. It occupied its own branch of the family tree, a relatively isolated position that suggested it had diverged from its closest relatives early in its evolutionary history and had been evolving independently for a significant period of time, accumulating the suite of deep-diving adaptations that made it so distinctive. This isolation on the family tree is significant. It means that the deep-diving adaptations of Abyssosaurus were not inherited from a recent ancestor. They were not the result of a minor tweak to an existing body plan. They were the result of a long, independent evolutionary trajectory, a sustained period of natural selection favoring individuals that were better and better adapted to the deep-sea environment. This suggests that the lineage leading to Abyssosaurus had been living in or near deep water for millions of years, gradually accumulating the anatomical changes that we see preserved in the single known skeleton. The third paper, the most recent, took the analysis even further, exploring the ecological implications of the anatomy and drawing explicit comparisons with modern deep-diving animals, particularly sperm whales. This paper is where the story of convergent evolution comes into sharp focus, and it is where the scientific narrative of Abyssosaurus reaches its most compelling. But before we get to the comparisons, before we explore the extraordinary parallels between a Cretaceous marine reptile and a modern mammal, we need to spend more time with the bones. We need to understand exactly what this animal looked like, how it moved, how it hunted, and how it survived in one of the most hostile environments on Earth. Let us reconstruct Abyssosaurus, piece by piece, bone by bone, starting with that remarkable skull. The skull was short. This is one of the first and most striking features that Berezan noted. In most plesiosaurs, the skull is elongated, designed for rapid lateral movements of the head to catch small, fast-moving prey. The long-necked plesiosaurs had small, narrow skulls with pointed snouts, perfect for darting the head sideways through a school of fish and snapping up individual prey items. Even some of the shorter-necked forms had relatively elongated skulls, albeit more heavily built, designed for different types of predation. The skull of Abyssosaurus was different. It was short and triangular, broader at the back where the jaw muscles attached and tapering to a relatively blunt snout. This shape suggests a different feeding strategy. A short, broad skull with strong jaw muscles is a skull designed for a powerful bite, for seizing and holding prey rather than for rapid lateral strikes. This is the skull of an ambush predator, an animal that does not chase its prey through open water but instead waits, motionless, and then lunges forward in a single, explosive strike, clamping its jaws shut on whatever it has caught. The teeth, to the extent that they are preserved in the specimen, are consistent with this interpretation. They are robust, conical, and slightly recurved, designed for gripping slippery prey and preventing escape. These are not the delicate, needle-like teeth of a fish specialist. These are the teeth of a generalist predator that seized whatever it could catch: large fish, squid, other marine reptiles, perhaps even the occasional unwary ammonite, and held on with a vice-like grip. And then the eyes. We have already discussed the enormous orbits, but it is worth dwelling on them further, because they are perhaps the single most diagnostic feature of Abyssosaurus, the feature that most clearly and unambiguously identifies this animal as a deep-water specialist. The size of an animal's eyes is, in general, a reliable indicator of its visual ecology. Large eyes gather more light, and in low-light environments, the ability to gather light is the difference between seeing and not seeing, between catching prey and starving, between detecting a predator and being eaten. The relationship between eye size and light availability has been documented across a vast range of animal groups, from insects to mammals, from fish to birds. In every case, the pattern is the same. Species that live in dimly lit environments tend to have larger eyes, relative to their body size, than species that live in brightly lit environments. The orbits of Abyssosaurus were proportionally larger than those of any other known plesiosaur. This is not a subtle difference. It is a dramatic one, immediately visible in the skull, and it tells us, with as much certainty as the fossil record allows, that this animal lived in a world where light was scarce. What would these eyes have looked like in life? We can only speculate, but by analogy with modern deep-sea animals, we can make educated guesses. The eyes were probably very large, dark, and possibly forward-facing or at least somewhat convergent, providing some degree of binocular vision that would have been useful for judging distance in the dark, for targeting prey with precision in an environment where every strike had to count. The retina of these eyes was almost certainly dominated by rod cells, the photoreceptor cells that are most sensitive to light, rather than cone cells, which provide color vision but are less sensitive. In the deep ocean, color is largely irrelevant. The only light available is the faint blue-green glow of bioluminescence, produced by deep-sea organisms to lure prey, communicate with mates, or confuse predators. The eyes of Abyssosaurus would have been tuned to detect this light, scanning the darkness for the telltale flicker of a bioluminescent flash that would reveal the presence of prey. Imagine the scene. You are Abyssosaurus. You have sunk, slowly and deliberately, through the water column, your dense bones carrying you down past the sunlit surface, past the twilight zone, into the realm of perpetual darkness. You are suspended in blackness. The water around you is cold and still. You can feel the pressure, immense and constant, pressing in on every surface of your body. You are motionless, conserving oxygen, waiting. And then, in the distance, a flash of light. A tiny point of blue-green luminescence, appearing and disappearing in the darkness. Something is out there. Something alive. Your enormous eyes swivel toward the light, gathering every photon, building a ghostly image in your brain. You wait. The light flashes again, closer now. You tense your muscles, readying your flippers for a single, explosive lunge. And then you strike. This is speculative, of course. We cannot know exactly how Abyssosaurus hunted. But the anatomy supports this general picture, and the comparison with modern deep-diving predators reinforces it. Now let us move beyond the skull and consider the rest of the body. The neck of Abyssosaurus was relatively short for a plesiosaur, though not as dramatically shortened as in the most extreme pliosaurs. This is consistent with the ambush predation hypothesis. A long neck is useful for surface-dwelling plesiosaurs that need to sweep their heads through schools of fish, but in the deep ocean, where prey encounters are rare and explosive, a shorter, more rigid neck would provide better control and more power during a lunge. A shorter neck also reduces the overall length of the body, making the animal more compact and more streamlined, which would be advantageous for maneuvering in deep water. The torso was robust. The ribs were thick and heavily built, and the vertebrae were solid and dense. The overall impression is of a heavy, compact body, built more for sinking than for swimming, more for endurance than for speed. This is not an animal that chased its prey over long distances. This is an animal that descended, waited, and struck. The flippers are particularly interesting. Plesiosaurs are famous for their four-flippered locomotion, a unique arrangement not seen in any modern animal. Most marine animals use either their forelimbs or their hind limbs for primary propulsion, but plesiosaurs used all four, a system that provided exceptional maneuverability and the ability to generate thrust in virtually any direction. The flippers of Abyssosaurus, as preserved in the specimen, suggest an animal that was capable of controlled, precise movements rather than sustained high-speed swimming. This makes sense in the context of deep diving. A deep-diving animal does not need to be fast. It needs to be efficient. It needs to be able to descend to great depths using as little energy as possible, remain at depth for extended periods, and return to the surface with enough oxygen to spare. Speed is secondary to endurance. And the body plan of Abyssosaurus, heavy, dense, compact, with flippers suited for controlled maneuvering rather than rapid acceleration, is the body plan of an endurance diver. But there is another feature of the postcranial skeleton that deserves attention, and it relates to one of the most fundamental challenges of deep diving, dealing with pressure. As we discussed earlier, pressure increases by roughly 1 atmosphere for every 10 meters of depth. At 100 meters, the pressure is 10 atmospheres. At 1000 meters, it is 100 atmospheres. At the depths that Abyssosaurus may have reached, the pressure would have been staggering, enough to compress any air-filled space in the body to a tiny fraction of its surface volume. Modern deep-diving mammals have evolved a remarkable suite of adaptations to cope with this pressure. The rib cage of a sperm whale, for example, is not rigid like ours. It is flexible, with joints between the ribs and the sternum that allow the chest cavity to compress as the animal descends. The lungs collapse at depth, forcing the air out of the delicate alveoli and into the more robust bronchi and trachea, where it cannot be absorbed into the blood. This prevents nitrogen from dissolving in the blood at high pressure, which in turn prevents the potentially fatal condition known as decompression sickness, or the bends, when the animal returns to the surface and the dissolved nitrogen comes out of solution as bubbles. We cannot know whether Abyssosaurus had flexible ribs in the same way that modern deep-diving mammals do, because the degree of flexibility in the rib cage depends on soft tissue structures, cartilage and ligaments, that do not fossilize. But we can note that the ribs of Abyssosaurus, while thick and dense, show certain features that are at least consistent with the degree of flexibility, and the overall proportions of the rib cage, relative to the body, are suggestive of an animal that could tolerate chest compression at depth. This is one of the frustrations of paleontology. The fossil record preserves hard tissue, bone and tooth, with exquisite fidelity, but it tells us almost nothing about soft tissue, about muscles and organs and blood vessels and cartilage. We can see the skeleton of Abyssosaurus, and from the skeleton, we can infer a great deal about the animal's ecology and behavior. But there are limits. There are questions that the bones alone cannot answer. And in those gaps, in those silences in the fossil record, we must turn to analogy, to comparison with living animals, to fill in the picture as best we can. And the most compelling comparison, the one that illuminates the biology of Abyssosaurus most powerfully, is the comparison with the modern sperm whale. The sperm whale. Physeter macrocephalus. The largest toothed predator on Earth. An animal that regularly dives to depths of 1,000 meters, and has been recorded at depths exceeding 2,000 meters, making it one of the deepest diving mammals alive. An animal that can hold its breath for over an hour, descending into the blackness of the deep ocean to hunt giant squid and other deep-sea prey. An animal that, like Abyssosaurus, solved the seemingly impossible problem of being an air-breathing predator in the deepest, darkest, most hostile environment on the planet. Abyssosaurus and the sperm whale are separated by more than 130 million years of evolutionary time. They are not related. They share no recent common ancestor. The plesiosaurs were marine reptiles. The sperm whale is a marine mammal. They belong to entirely different classes of vertebrates, separated by vast stretches of the tree of life. And yet, when we compare their anatomies, their ecologies, and their apparent hunting strategies, the similarities are astonishing. This is the phenomenon known as convergent evolution, and it is one of the most powerful and beautiful concepts in all of biology. Convergent evolution occurs when two unrelated organisms, facing similar environmental challenges, independently evolve similar solutions. The classic example is the wing. Birds and bats both have wings. Birds and bats both fly. But their wings are constructed differently. The bird's wing is supported by a single elongated finger, while the bat's wing is supported by 4 elongated fingers with a membrane of skin stretched between them, and they evolved independently from wingless ancestors. The flight of birds and the flight of bats are convergent solutions to the same physical problem: how to generate lift and thrust in the air. Convergent evolution is everywhere in nature. Sharks and dolphins have similar streamlined body shapes, but sharks are fish and dolphins are mammals. The eyes of octopuses and the eyes of vertebrates are remarkably similar in structure, but they evolved independently from eyeless ancestors. The spines of hedgehogs and porcupines serve similar defensive functions, but hedgehogs are insectivores and porcupines are rodents. The reason convergent evolution is so common is that the physical laws that govern the universe are the same everywhere and for all time. The physics of water resistance is the same whether you are a Jurassic ichthyosaur or a modern dolphin. The optics of light gathering are the same whether you are a Cretaceous plesiosaur or a modern squid. The challenges of deep diving, the pressure, the cold, the darkness, the scarcity of food, are the same whether you are an ancient marine reptile or a modern whale. And because the challenges are the same, the solutions tend to converge. Abyssosaurus and the sperm whale faced the same challenges, and they arrived at strikingly similar solutions. Let us examine these parallels one by one. First, dense bones. We have already discussed the osteosclerosis of Abyssosaurus, the abnormally dense bone tissue that served as ballast for the animal's descent into deep water. Sperm whales also have unusually dense bones for a mammal. Their ribs, their vertebrae, their skull bones are all heavier and denser than those of comparable-sized mammals that do not dive to great depths. In both cases, dense bones serve the same function: they reduce buoyancy, making it easier for the animal to sink to depth without expending large amounts of energy on active swimming. Second, large eyes or enhanced sensory capabilities. Abyssosaurus had enormous eyes adapted for detecting faint light in the deep ocean. Sperm whales have relatively small eyes for their body size, which might seem like a contradiction, but sperm whales have compensated for this by evolving a completely different sensory system for hunting in the dark. They use echolocation, a biological sonar system in which the whale produces powerful clicks that travel through the water, bounce off objects, and return to the whale as echoes, providing a detailed acoustic image of the environment. The sperm whale's echolocation system is the most powerful biological sonar on Earth, capable of detecting prey at distances of several hundred meters in total darkness. Here is the key insight: both Abyssosaurus and the sperm whale evolved enhanced sensory systems for hunting in the dark, but they did it differently. Abyssosaurus enhanced its vision. The sperm whale enhanced its hearing. Both solutions work. Both solve the same fundamental problem: how to find prey when you cannot see. The difference in the specific solution reflects the different starting points of the two lineages. Plesiosaurs were visual predators, and so the lineage leading to Abyssosaurus enhanced its visual system. Whales, particularly toothed whales, already had a rudimentary echolocation system inherited from their ancestors, and so the sperm whale lineage enhanced that. Convergent evolution does not mean identical evolution. It means that similar problems produce similar general solutions, even if the specific details differ. Third, ambush predation. Sperm whales are thought to be ambush predators in the deep ocean, at least some of the time. Rather than actively chasing down individual squid, they may descend to a target depth and simply drift, waiting for prey to come within striking distance. Some researchers have suggested that sperm whales may even use their echolocation clicks to stun or disorient prey, but this remains controversial. What is not controversial is that sperm whales are patient hunters. They spend long periods at depth, moving slowly, conserving energy, and waiting for opportunities. Abyssosaurus, based on its anatomy, appears to have been a similar kind of predator. The short, powerful skull, the robust teeth, the compact body, the dense bones, all of these features are consistent with an animal that sank to depth, waited in the darkness, and then lunged at prey that came within range. The parallels with the sperm whale are striking. Both animals are large, deep-diving, ambush-oriented predators that operate in an environment where energy conservation is paramount. Fourth, metabolic efficiency. Deep diving places enormous demands on an animal's metabolism. The dive itself consumes energy, even if the animal is sinking passively. The time spent at depth must be fueled by stored oxygen, which places a strict upper limit on dive duration. And the return to the surface requires active swimming, consuming still more energy and oxygen. To make deep diving viable, an animal must be metabolically efficient, able to extract the maximum benefit from a given amount of stored oxygen. Sperm whales achieve this through a suite of physiological adaptations. They have exceptionally high concentrations of myoglobin, the oxygen-storing protein in muscle tissue. They can redirect blood flow during a dive, shunting it away from non-essential organs and toward the brain and heart. They can tolerate levels of carbon dioxide and lactic acid in their blood that would incapacitate a human. They can even enter a state of partial metabolic suspension during long dives, reducing their oxygen consumption to a minimum. We cannot know whether Abyssosaurus had these specific physiological adaptations. Soft tissue does not fossilize. But we can note that the overall body plan of Abyssosaurus is consistent with metabolic efficiency. The compact body, the dense bones, the relatively small head, all suggest an animal that was optimized for low-energy diving rather than high-speed pursuit. And the general principle of convergent evolution tells us that if two unrelated animals face the same metabolic challenge, they are likely to evolve similar metabolic solutions, even if we cannot directly observe those solutions in the fossil record. Fifth, and perhaps most intriguingly, both Abyssosaurus and the sperm whale appear to have been solitary or semi-solitary hunters in the deep ocean. Sperm whales are social animals, living in groups at the surface, but when they dive alone. Each whale descends into the abyss by itself, hunts by itself, and returns to the surface by itself. The deep ocean is too vast, too dark, and too sparsely populated with prey for cooperative hunting to be effective. In the deep, you are on your own. We obviously cannot know whether Abyssosaurus was solitary, but the ecological logic is the same. Deep-sea hunting is, by its nature, a solitary activity. The prey density is too low to support multiple large predators in close proximity. The darkness makes visual communication between individuals impossible. And the need for stealth, the need to remain motionless and silent while waiting for prey, is incompatible with the movements and sounds of a group. If Abyssosaurus hunted in the deep ocean, it almost certainly hunted alone. These parallels are remarkable. They span a gap of more than 130 million years. They connect an extinct marine reptile with a living marine mammal. And they tell us something profound about the nature of evolution itself, that the solutions to life's challenges are not arbitrary. They are constrained by physics, by chemistry, by the fundamental realities of the environment. And when two lineages face the same realities, they tend to converge on the same solutions, like two rivers flowing toward the same sea. But let us return to the Tethys. Let us return to the world that Abyssosaurus inhabited, and try to understand what that world looked like, what it felt like, what it sounded like for a creature that spent its life commuting between the sunlit surface and the lightless deep. The Tethys Sea of the early Cretaceous was not a single, uniform body of water. It was a complex mosaic of shallow seas, deep basins, island chains, and submarine ridges, its geography shaped by the ongoing breakup of the supercontinent Pangaea and the restless shifting of tectonic plates. In some areas, the Tethys was shallow, just tens of meters deep, its warm waters supporting lush ecosystems of coral, algae, and benthic invertebrates. In other areas, it was deeper, hundreds or even thousands of meters, with submarine canyons and abyssal plains that plunged into darkness. It is in these deeper areas that Abyssosaurus would have made its living. The shallow seas were already claimed, already filled with predators, the long-necked plesiosaurs patrolling the surface waters, the pliosaurs dominating the mid-water column, the sharks and large fish competing for every available prey item. The shallow Tethys was a crowded, competitive environment, and for a plesiosaur lineage looking to escape the competition, the deep offered an alternative. This is one of the fundamental drivers of evolution, competition avoidance. When the easy niches are taken, the adventurous and the desperate look for new ones. In the Tethys Sea, the new niche was down past the reach of the other predators, down past the photic zone, down into the dark, cold, high-pressure world of the deep ocean. And the lineage that would become Abyssosaurus went there. The transition would not have been sudden. Evolution does not work that way. It would have been gradual, spanning millions of years, proceeding in tiny, incremental steps. An ancestor of Abyssosaurus, a relatively ordinary plesiosaur, might have begun diving slightly deeper than its peers, reaching depths of 100 meters, then 200, then 300, exploiting prey resources that other plesiosaurs could not reach. Each generation that dove a little deeper, that had slightly denser bones, slightly larger eyes, slightly more efficient oxygen storage, would have had a competitive advantage over its peers, and over time, natural selection would have pushed the lineage deeper and deeper, until it became the specialized deep-water predator preserved in the Chuvashia limestone. This is the power of natural selection. It does not plan. It does not foresee. It does not know that it is producing a deep-sea predator. It simply favors individuals that are slightly better suited to their current environment, and over time, those small advantages accumulate into dramatic transformations. The Abyssosaurus that we see in the fossil record is the end product of millions of years of this relentless, undirected, but profoundly effective process. What was it like down there, in the deep Tethys? We can extrapolate from what we know about modern deep oceans, adjusted for the warmer climate of the Cretaceous. The deep Tethys would have been dark. Absolutely, completely dark. No sunlight penetrates below about 1,000 meters in any ocean, and the Tethys was no exception. Below the photic zone, the only light would have been biological, the cold, ghostly glow of bioluminescent organisms. In the modern deep ocean, bioluminescence is ubiquitous. It is estimated that more than 75% of deep-sea animals produce their own light, using chemical reactions involving molecules like luciferin and luciferase. This light is used for a variety of purposes: to lure prey, to attract mates, to communicate, to startle predators, or simply to illuminate the immediate surroundings. The deep Tethys would have been similarly lit, a vast, dark space punctuated by fleeting sparks and glows and flashes of blue-green light. For Abyssosaurus, this bioluminescent landscape would have been both the background and the target. Its enormous eyes, adapted for maximum light sensitivity, would have been scanning this field of biological stars, searching for the specific pattern of light that signaled prey. A fish with photophores along its belly. A squid flashing its chromatophores in a defensive display. A crustacean trailing a cloud of luminescent mucus. Each of these would have been a potential target, a point of light in the darkness that Abyssosaurus could track, approach, and strike. The temperature of the deep Tethys would have been warmer than the deep modern ocean. In the early Cretaceous, the global climate was significantly warmer than today, and this warmth extended into the deep ocean. Modern deep ocean temperatures hover around 2 to 4 degrees Celsius in most places, but in the Cretaceous, deep water temperatures may have been 10 to 15 degrees Celsius or even higher. This would have been advantageous for Abyssosaurus. As a reptile, its metabolic rate would have been strongly influenced by temperature. Warmer water would have meant a higher metabolic rate, which would have been a double-edged sword, more energy available for hunting and swimming, but also a higher rate of oxygen consumption, reducing dive duration. The balance between these competing demands would have shaped the animal's diving behavior, determining how deep it went, how long it stayed, and how often it returned to the surface to breathe. The pressure in the deep Tethys would have been the same as in any modern ocean at equivalent depth. Pressure is a function of the weight of the overlying water column, and water has been essentially the same density for billions of years. At 1,000 meters, the pressure would have been 100 atmospheres. At 2,000 meters, 200 atmospheres. Whatever depth Abyssosaurus reached, the pressure would have been crushing by any surface standard. How deep did Abyssosaurus actually dive? This is one of the questions that the fossil record cannot directly answer. We have no depth gauge embedded in the bones, no chemical signature in the enamel that records maximum depth. We can only infer diving depth from the suite of anatomical adaptations that we observe, and from comparison with modern deep diving animals that have similar adaptations. Based on the degree of osteosclerosis, the size of the orbits, and the overall body plan, the researchers who studied Abyssosaurus have suggested that it may have been capable of diving to depths of several hundred meters, and possibly considerably deeper. The comparison with sperm whales is instructive. Sperm whales routinely dive to 1,000 meters, and occasionally to 2,000 meters or more, and they have a similar set of adaptations: dense bones, large body size, efficient oxygen storage, and the ability to remain at depth for extended periods. If Abyssosaurus had a comparable level of physiological specialization, it may have been capable of similar depths. But we must be cautious. Abyssosaurus was a reptile, not a mammal, and reptiles have a different set of physiological constraints. Reptiles are ectothermic, or at least partially so, meaning that their body temperature is influenced by the temperature of their environment. This has implications for metabolic rate, oxygen consumption, and dive duration. In some ways, ectothermy might have been an advantage for deep diving. A lower metabolic rate means lower oxygen consumption, which means longer dive times. Some modern reptiles, like leatherback sea turtles, are capable of remarkably deep dives, reaching depths of over 1,000 meters, and their relatively low metabolic rates may be part of the reason. So it is not unreasonable to suggest that Abyssosaurus, with its suite of deep diving adaptations and its reptilian physiology, may have been capable of dives comparable to those of modern sperm whales, and possibly even longer in duration, if its metabolic rate was sufficiently low. Let us now turn to the question of what Abyssosaurus ate. What was it hunting in the deep waters of the Tethys? This is, again, a question that the fossil record cannot directly answer. We have no fossilized stomach contents from Abyssosaurus, no coprolites definitively attributed to the species, no trace fossils that record its feeding behavior. All we have are the teeth, the jaw, and the general body plan, from which we must infer the diet. The teeth of Abyssosaurus, as we have discussed, were robust and conical, suitable for seizing and holding slippery prey. This suggests a diet of fish, squid, and other free-swimming organisms, the nekton of the deep ocean. In the modern deep ocean, the primary prey items for large predators are mesopelagic and bathopelagic fish, deep-sea squid, and various crustaceans. In the Cretaceous, the deep-sea fauna would have been different in specific composition but probably similar in general structure: fish, cephalopods, and crustaceans, all adapted for life in the dark, high-pressure environment of the deep ocean. Cephalopods deserve special mention. In the modern ocean, cephalopods, particularly squid, are the primary prey of sperm whales in the deep ocean. The famous battles between sperm whales and giant squid are the stuff of legend, but in reality, sperm whales probably eat mostly smaller squid, the giant squid being a relatively rare and difficult prey item. In the Cretaceous, the cephalopod fauna was different from today. The ammonites, which were externally shelled cephalopods, were abundant in the surface waters, but their distribution in the deep ocean is less clear. However, other groups of cephalopods, including the ancestors of modern squid and octopuses, were also present in the Cretaceous, and some of these may have been deep-water species. The belemnites, another extinct group of cephalopods, were particularly abundant in the Cretaceous seas, including the Tethys. Belemnites were squid-like animals with internal shells, and they are known from a wide range of marine environments, including relatively deep water. It is entirely possible that belemnites and other cephalopods formed a significant part of the diet of Abyssosaurus, much as modern squid form a significant part of the diet of sperm whales. Fish would also have been important prey. The deep-sea fish fauna of the Cretaceous is poorly known, because deep-sea fish are rarely preserved in the fossil record, their small, delicate skeletons being easily destroyed by the processes of decay and sedimentation. But we know that deep-sea fish existed in the Cretaceous, because we find their otoliths, the small, dense ear bones that are often the only part of a fish skeleton to survive fossilization. These otoliths tell us that a diverse fauna of deep-sea fish was present in the Tethys, and some of these fish would have been potential prey for Abyssosaurus. Crustaceans, too, may have been part of the diet. Deep-sea crustaceans, including shrimp-like forms and various other arthropods, are abundant in the modern deep ocean and were probably present in the Cretaceous deep ocean as well. However, crustaceans would have been relatively small prey for an animal the size of Abyssosaurus, and they were probably supplementary rather than primary food items. The picture that emerges is of a generalist deep-sea predator, an animal that ate whatever it could catch in the dark, sparse environment of the deep Tethys. Fish, squid, belemnites, crustaceans, anything that was edible and within striking distance was fair game. This is consistent with the ambush predation hypothesis. In the deep ocean, where prey encounters are rare and unpredictable, a predator cannot afford to be picky. It must eat whatever it finds whenever it finds it. There is something profoundly lonely about the image of Abyssosaurus that emerges from this analysis. A solitary predator, hanging motionless in the darkness of the deep Tethys, its enormous eyes scanning the blackness for the faint glow of bioluminescent prey. Waiting. Patient. Endlessly patient. Because in the deep ocean, patience is not a virtue, it is a survival strategy. An animal that wastes energy on unnecessary movement in the deep ocean will burn through its oxygen stores and be forced to return to the surface before it has caught anything. An animal that waits, that conserves its energy, that tolerates long periods of inactivity and boredom, will outlast its more restless competitors. This patience is something that Abyssosaurus shares with the sperm whale. Sperm whales can remain at depth for over an hour, drifting in the darkness, occasionally producing echolocation clicks but otherwise motionless, waiting for the acoustic signature of prey. This is a fundamentally different hunting strategy from the high-speed pursuit predation that we associate with surface-dwelling predators like dolphins or tuna. Deep-sea hunting is slow. It is quiet. It is meditative, almost. And it requires a physiology and a temperament that are entirely different from those of a surface predator. We can imagine Abyssosaurus performing a similar routine. A breath at the surface. A slow, controlled descent, the dense bones pulling the animal down through the water column like a stone. The light fading, the water cooling, the pressure building. Past the photic zone. Past the twilight zone. Into the midnight zone. The animal reaches its hunting depth and stabilizes, adjusting its buoyancy with subtle movements of the flippers. And then it waits. Minutes pass. Perhaps tens of minutes. The darkness is absolute, except for the occasional flash of bioluminescence in the distance. The animal is conserving oxygen, its metabolic rate suppressed, its heart rate slowed, its muscles relaxed. It is a machine of patience, a predator optimized not for speed or power but for endurance and efficiency. And then, a flash of light. Closer than the others. A deep-sea fish, perhaps, with a row of photophores along its belly, advertising its presence to potential mates or warning off competitors. The fish does not know that a predator is watching. The fish is small, perhaps 30 or 40 centimeters long, a pittance of a meal for a large plesiosaur. But in the deep ocean, you do not turn down a meal. Abyssosaurus adjusts its position with a subtle sculling of its flippers. Its enormous eyes lock onto the flickering light. It calculates distance, speed, trajectory. And then, with a single explosive lunge, it strikes. The jaws close around the fish. The conical teeth grip the slippery body. The prey is swallowed. And Abyssosaurus returns to its waiting. This scenario is, of course, imaginary. We cannot reconstruct the exact hunting behavior of an animal that has been extinct for 130 million years. But it is grounded in the anatomy, in the ecological logic, and in the comparison with modern deep-diving predators. It is the best story we can tell, given the evidence we have. And that, in a sense, is what paleontology is, the telling of stories grounded in evidence. The fossil record does not speak for itself. It requires interpretation. It requires imagination, disciplined imagination constrained by data and logic, but imagination nonetheless. And the story of Abyssosaurus is one of the most compelling stories that the fossil record has to offer. We have spent considerable time on the biology of Abyssosaurus, on its anatomy, its ecology, its hunting strategy. Now let us return to the science, to the process of discovery and interpretation, because the story of how we came to understand this animal is as fascinating as the animal itself. We have already discussed the initial discovery in 1992, the years of neglect, and Alexander Berezan's re-examination of the specimen in 2018. But the scientific story does not end with Berezan's initial insights. It continues through 3 published research papers, each building on the last, each adding new layers of understanding to our picture of Abyssosaurus. The first paper, as we discussed, described the specimen and named the species. This is the foundational act of taxonomic science, the formal introduction of a new species to the scientific community. The paper would have included detailed descriptions of every preserved skeletal element, measurements of bone dimensions, descriptions of bone texture and density, and comparisons with other plesiosaur species. It would have included photographs and diagrams, showing the bones from multiple angles, highlighting the distinctive features that set Abyssosaurus apart from its relatives. And it would have included a formal diagnosis, a concise statement of the features that define the species and distinguish it from all other known species. The naming of a new species is a moment of creation in science. Before the paper is published, the animal has no name, no identity, no place in the scientific literature. After the paper is published, it exists, in the scientific sense. It has a name that other researchers can use. It has a diagnosis that other researchers can evaluate. It has a type specimen that other researchers can examine. It is, in a very real sense, brought back from the dead, resurrected from the limestone that had entombed it for 130 million years. The name itself is significant. Abyssosaurus. The abyss lizard. In paleontology, species names are not chosen arbitrarily. They are typically chosen to reflect some important feature of the animal, its appearance, its ecology, its geographic origin, or to honor a person or institution. The name Abyssosaurus tells us immediately what the namers considered to be the most important feature of this animal, its association with the abyss, with the deep ocean. The name is a hypothesis embedded in nomenclature, a declaration that this animal was a deep-sea creature. The second paper placed Abyssosaurus in its phylogenetic context. Phylogenetics, the science of reconstructing evolutionary relationships, is one of the most important and most technically demanding areas of modern paleontology. It requires the identification and coding of dozens or hundreds of anatomical characters across dozens or hundreds of species, the construction of large data matrices, and the use of sophisticated computer algorithms to analyze the data and produce the most parsimonious, the simplest, family tree that is consistent with the observed patterns of similarity and difference. The phylogenetic analysis of Abyssosaurus confirmed that it was a plesiosaur, but it also revealed that it occupied an unusual position on the plesiosaur family tree. It was not closely related to any of the well-known plesiosaur groups. It was not a classic plesiosauromorph, despite having a relatively long neck by pliosaur standards. It was not a classic pliosauromorph, despite having a relatively short, powerful skull. It seemed to be something in between, or perhaps something entirely different, a separate lineage that had diverged from the main plesiosaur radiation early in its history and had been evolving independently for millions of years. This phylogenetic isolation is significant because it tells us that the deep-diving adaptations of Abyssosaurus were not shared with close relatives. They were unique to this lineage. They evolved independently, in response to the specific selective pressures of the deep-sea environment. This is another example of convergent evolution, but this time within the plesiosaurs themselves. While other plesiosaur lineages were diversifying at the surface, the Abyssosaurus lineage was diversifying in the deep, evolving its own unique set of adaptations in response to a completely different set of environmental challenges. The third paper, the most recent and perhaps the most important, took the analysis beyond anatomy and phylogenetics and into the realm of ecology and convergent evolution. This paper is where the comparisons with sperm whales are made explicit, where the parallels between an extinct marine reptile and a living marine mammal are laid out in detail, and where the broader implications of the Abyssosaurus discovery are explored. This third paper is significant not just for what it says about Abyssosaurus, but for what it says about the process of paleontological understanding. It took 3 papers, published over nearly a decade, to fully interpret the anatomy and ecological role of a single skeleton. This is not unusual in paleontology. The interpretation of a complex fossil is not a one-step process. It is iterative. Each round of analysis reveals new questions, new possibilities, new challenges. The first paper describes what is there. The second paper asks where it fits. The third paper asks what it means. And what it means, in the case of Abyssosaurus, is something profound. It means that the plesiosaurs were more ecologically diverse than we ever imagined. It means that the deep ocean of the Cretaceous was home to large, specialized predators that we have only the barest glimpse of in the fossil record. It means that convergent evolution, the independent origin of similar solutions to similar problems, operates on scales of tens and hundreds of millions of years, linking creatures that lived in worlds separated by geological epochs. And it means that the fossil record, for all its richness, is still full of surprises. The tectonic history of the fossil site deserves our attention as well, because it is a reminder of just how dramatically the face of the Earth has changed since Abyssosaurus swam through the deep Tethys. The specimen was found in the Chuvash Republic, deep in the interior of Russia, hundreds of kilometers from the nearest ocean. To find a marine reptile in landlocked Chuvashia is, on the face of it, absurd. It would be like finding a whale skeleton in Kansas, or a deep-sea fish in the Sahara Desert. And yet, it makes perfect sense when you understand the geological history of the region. 130 million years ago, Chuvashia was underwater. It was part of the vast northern margin of the Tethys Sea, a shallow to moderately deep marine shelf that extended across much of what is now European Russia. The sediments that accumulated on this shelf, the limestones and marls and chalks that formed from the rain of calcareous marine organisms, are now exposed at the surface, uplifted by tectonic forces and eroded by millions of years of weathering. The limestone quarries of Chuvashia are, in a very real sense, ancient sea floors, raised from the depths and displayed under the open sky. The process by which this happened is part of the grand narrative of plate tectonics, the slow, relentless movement of the Earth's crustal plates that has reshaped the surface of the planet over hundreds of millions of years. The Tethys Sea began to close during the late Cretaceous, as the African and Indian plates began to converge on the Eurasian plate. This convergence was driven by the same forces that drive all plate tectonics: the convection of the Earth's mantle, the semi-molten rock that lies beneath the rigid crust, circulating in vast, slow currents powered by the heat of the Earth's interior. As Africa and India pushed northward, the floor of the Tethys was gradually subducted, pushed down beneath the Eurasian plate, and consumed by the mantle. The Tethys shrank. Its waters retreated. The marine sediments that had accumulated on its floor and margins were compressed, folded, and uplifted. The collision of India with Asia produced the Himalayas, the highest mountain range on Earth, built from the crushed and crumpled remains of the Tethyan sea floor. The collision of Africa with Europe produced the Alps, the Carpathians, and the other mountain ranges of southern Europe, all of them built from the same material. But not all of the Tethyan sediments were caught up in these mountain-building events. Some of them, particularly those on the northern margins of the Tethys, far from the zones of active collision, were simply uplifted gently by the broad-scale tectonic adjustments that accompanied the closure of the sea. The limestones of Chuvashia are an example. They were not dramatically folded or faulted. They were simply raised, gradually, over millions of years, from the sea floor to the land surface, a slow, gentle elevator ride that brought the remains of Abyssosaurus from the bottom of an ancient ocean to the surface of a modern republic. This is the story of the landscape. The sea became land. The ocean floor became a quarry. And a marine reptile that had hunted in the deep waters of the Tethys was preserved, entombed in limestone, and carried by the slow movement of continents to a place that it would never have recognized, a place where the sea is a distant memory, preserved only in the rocks. There is a philosophical dimension to the Abyssosaurus story that deserves exploration, and it relates to the nature of the fossil record itself. The fossil record is not a complete record of life on Earth. It is not even close to a complete record. It is a biased, fragmentary, and profoundly incomplete sample of the organisms that have lived on this planet over the past 3.5 billion years. The vast majority of species that have ever existed left no fossil record at all. Their bodies decayed, their bones dissolved, their traces were erased by the relentless processes of geological destruction and recycling. The fossil record preserves only a tiny fraction of life, and even that fraction is heavily biased toward organisms with hard parts, bones, shells, teeth, that resist decay, organisms that lived in environments where preservation was likely, shallow marine settings, lake bottoms, river deltas, and organisms that lived in sufficient abundance to produce enough remains that at least some of them would survive the geological gauntlet. Abyssosaurus violates all of these biases. It was a deep-water animal, living in an environment where preservation is unlikely. The deep ocean floor is a poor place for fossil preservation, because the cold, dark conditions promote the dissolution of calcium carbonate, the mineral that makes up bones and shells, and because the low rate of sedimentation means that organic remains are exposed to the water column for long periods before being buried. Deep-sea fossils are rare, and deep-sea vertebrate fossils are exceptionally rare. So how did Abyssosaurus end up in the fossil record? How did a deep-water predator come to be preserved in the limestone of a continental shelf? The answer probably lies in the circumstances of its death. Abyssosaurus was an air breather. It had to return to the surface to breathe. And it was at the surface, or in the relatively shallow waters of the continental shelf, that it was most likely to be preserved. If an Abyssosaurus died at depth, its body would have sunk to the deep ocean floor, where it would have been consumed by scavengers and decomposed in the cold, dark water, leaving little or no trace. But if it died at the surface, or while ascending or descending through the shallow waters of the shelf, its body might have sunk to the relatively shallow shelf floor, where sedimentation rates were higher and preservation conditions were better. It is also possible that the specimen represents an individual that was already in poor health, perhaps old, sick, or injured, and that had returned to the shallower waters of the shelf to rest or recover, only to die there. Modern marine animals that are injured or ill often move to shallower, calmer waters, and it is not unreasonable to suppose that Abyssosaurus might have done the same. Whatever the specific circumstances of its death, the preservation of Abyssosaurus was a stroke of extraordinary luck. Out of all the individuals of this species that lived and died over millions of years, only one, as far as we know, was preserved in the fossil record. Only one skeleton survived the 130-million-year journey from the floor of the Tethys to the collection of a Russian museum. Only one set of bones was there for Alexander Berezan to find when he opened that drawer in 2018. This is the lottery of the fossil record. Billions of animals live and die without leaving any trace. A few, a very few, are preserved. And of those that are preserved, only a fraction are ever discovered. And of those that are discovered, only a fraction are ever properly studied. The odds against any individual animal entering the fossil record are astronomical. The odds against that fossil being discovered, recognized, and correctly interpreted are even more astronomical. And the odds against all of this happening for a deep-sea animal, an animal whose entire lifestyle made it unlikely to be preserved, are beyond calculation. And yet here we are. We have Abyssosaurus. One skeleton. One set of bones. One window into a world that would otherwise be completely invisible to us. This is what makes paleontology so extraordinary. It is a science of fragments and glimpses, of partial stories and incomplete pictures. And yet, from those fragments and glimpses, from those partial stories and incomplete pictures, we can reconstruct worlds. We can see the deep Tethys through the eyes of Abyssosaurus. We can feel the darkness, the pressure, the cold. We can imagine the patient waiting, the explosive strike, the slow ascent to the sunlit surface. We can do all of this because of one skeleton, preserved by chance, discovered by persistence, and interpreted by the accumulated wisdom of generations of scientists. The fossil record is not an archive. It is not a library. It is not a comprehensive catalogue of the history of life. It is, as one writer has put it, more like a series of snapshots taken at random intervals by a camera with a broken shutter, each snapshot showing a fraction of a second of a story that spans billions of years. Abyssosaurus is one of those snapshots. A single frame. A single moment. But what a moment it captures. It captures a marine reptile that broke the rules of its own group, descending into a world that no other plesiosaur ever conquered. It captures a case of convergent evolution so striking that it connects the Cretaceous to the present day. It captures a story of scientific detection that spans decades, from a chance discovery in a Russian quarry to a series of research papers that rewrote our understanding of plesiosaur ecology. And it captures, perhaps most profoundly, the sheer improbability of the fossil record itself, the fact that we know anything at all about the deep past, that any trace of these vanished worlds has survived the grinding, dissolving, recycling machinery of the earth. Abyssosaurus is a gift. An improbable, invaluable, irreplaceable gift from the deep past to the present. And the story it tells is far from over. Because every fossil, no matter how thoroughly studied, still has secrets to reveal. Every bone has more to say. And the single skeleton of Abyssosaurus, sitting in its collection in Russia, is still waiting, still patient, still ready to reveal whatever it has left to tell to the next researcher who comes along with fresh eyes and new questions. We have now reached the midpoint of our journey through the story of Abyssosaurus. We have explored the world it lived in, the Tethys Sea of the early Cretaceous, warm and vast and teeming with life. We have examined the animal's anatomy in detail, from its enormous eyes to its dense bones to its short, powerful skull. We have drawn parallels with modern sperm whales, marveling at the convergent evolution that links a Cretaceous reptile with a modern mammal across a gap of 130 million years. We have traced the story of its discovery, from a Russian quarry in 1992 to a moment of recognition in 2018. And we have reflected on the improbability of its preservation, the lottery of the fossil record that gave us this one precious skeleton. In the second part of our story, we will go deeper. We will explore in greater detail the specific anatomical adaptations that made Abyssosaurus's deep-diving lifestyle possible. We will examine the broader context of convergent evolution, looking at other examples from the history of life on Earth. We will consider the ecosystem of the deep Tethys, the world that Abyssosaurus inhabited, and ask what else might have lived there that we have never found. We will look at the techniques of modern paleontology, the tools and methods that researchers use to extract information from ancient bones. And we will return, at the end, to the philosophical questions raised by the Abyssosaurus story. What does the fossil record really tell us, and what does it leave out? What can we know about the deep past, and what must remain forever unknown? The story of Abyssosaurus is a story about darkness and depth, about patience and power, about the relentless creativity of evolution and the stubborn persistence of scientific inquiry. It is a story about a single skeleton that changed our understanding of an entire group of animals. And it is a story about the Earth itself, about the vast, slow processes that shape and reshape the surface of our planet, creating and destroying oceans, raising and lowering continents, burying and exposing the remains of creatures that lived in worlds unimaginably different from our own. The abyss remembers. The bones remember. And now, we remember too. The deep Tethys was dark. It was cold. It was crushing. And in that darkness, in that cold, under that crushing weight, something lived. Something hunted. Something waited. And 130 million years later, we found it. That is the miracle of Abyssosaurus. That is the miracle of paleontology. That is the miracle of the fossil record, imperfect and incomplete as it is. It gives us windows into vanished worlds. It connects us to the deep past. It reminds us that the Earth has been alive, truly alive, teeming with strange and wonderful creatures, for billions of years, and that our own brief moment on this planet is just the latest chapter in a story that began long before us and will continue long after we are gone. When the excavation team first encountered the fossilized remains embedded in the marine limestone outside the small town of Shumerlia, they knew they had found something significant. The bones were large, clearly marine, and appeared to belong to some variety of plesiosaur, those iconic marine reptiles that had dominated the seas throughout much of the Mesozoic era. The skeleton was remarkably complete, a rarity in paleontology where fragmentary remains are the norm rather than the exception. Over the course of several weeks, the team carefully extracted the fossil, encasing portions of it in protective plaster jackets for transport back to the regional museum in Cheboksary, the capital of Chuvashia. But here is where the story takes its first peculiar turn, one that would delay our understanding of this animal for more than 2 decades. The skeleton, once prepared and catalogued, was initially classified as simply another example of the plesiosaur family, those long-necked marine reptiles familiar to anyone with even a passing interest in prehistoric life. The skull, which would prove to be the key to understanding this animal's true nature, was either separated from the main skeleton during collection or became detached during preparation. In the organizational chaos that sometimes accompanies museum collections, particularly in smaller regional institutions with limited funding and staff, this skull was filed away separately, its connection to the more complete post-cranial skeleton severed not by geological processes but by human error and the simple chaos of institutional record-keeping. For years, the skeleton of Abyssosaurus rested in the collections of the Chuvash National Museum, labeled, catalogued, but fundamentally misunderstood. It was viewed as interesting but not exceptional, another data point in the well-established story of plesiosaur evolution. Researchers who examined it noted its unusually robust build, the peculiar density of its bones, the oddly proportioned limbs, but these observations were filed away as individual variations within known plesiosaur types. The true significance of what lay in those storage drawers remained hidden, waiting for the right combination of expertise, curiosity, and perhaps simple luck to bring its secrets to light. That moment arrived in 2018, when Alexander Berezan, a young Russian paleontologist specializing in Mesozoic marine reptiles, received permission to conduct a comprehensive review of the museum's plesiosaur holdings. Berezan had been researching the distribution of plesiosaur species across what had once been the vast Tethys Sea, that great tropical seaway that stretched from what is now the Mediterranean region all the way to Southeast Asia during the Mesozoic. He was particularly interested in specimens from the Early Cretaceous, a time period roughly 130 million years ago when plesiosaurs were diversifying into an array of ecological niches. As Berezan worked through the collection, examining specimens, taking measurements, photographing details, he came across the skeleton from Shumerlia. Even before detailed analysis, something about it struck him as unusual. The limb proportions were wrong for a typical plesiosaur. The vertebrae were too densely constructed. The ribs were extraordinarily thick and heavy. These were not the bones of an animal built for the kind of pursuit hunting or agile maneuvering typical of plesiosaurs. These were the bones of something else, something adapted for a very different mode of life. Berezan requested access to all material associated with the specimen, and it was then that the separated skull was located, brought out from storage, and reunited with the skeleton from which it had been divided. When Berezan first examined that skull, he immediately recognized that this was no ordinary plesiosaur. The skull was short, powerfully built, with a triangular profile quite unlike the elongated heads typical of most plesiosaur groups. But it was the eye sockets that truly captured his attention. They were enormous, proportionally far larger than those of any plesiosaur he had ever encountered. These were the eyes of an animal that lived in darkness, that hunted where light could not penetrate. Over the following months, Berezan conducted an exhaustive analysis of the specimen, comparing its anatomy to every known plesiosaur species, examining the geological context of its discovery, consulting with specialists in marine reptile evolution and biomechanics. His conclusion, published in a preliminary paper in late 2018, was startling. This was not merely an unusual plesiosaur, but a representative of an entirely new genus and species, one adapted for an ecological niche that no plesiosaur had previously been known to occupy. He named it Abyssosaurus myris, the wondrous lizard of the abyss. That initial paper represented only the beginning of our understanding of this remarkable animal. Science, particularly paleontology, is an iterative process, a gradual refinement of understanding as new data emerges and new analytical techniques are applied. The story of Abyssosaurus would eventually be told through 3 major research papers, each building upon the last, each revealing new layers of understanding about how this creature lived, hunted, and dominated an environment that seems almost alien to us, the abyssal zones of the early Cretaceous seas. But before we delve into the anatomy and adaptations that made Abyssosaurus such a remarkable predator, we must first understand the world in which it lived. The early Cretaceous was a time profoundly different from our own, a world of such warmth that ice caps were entirely absent, when sea levels stood dramatically higher than today, and when the very configuration of the continents bore little resemblance to the geography we know. 130 million years ago, the supercontinent of Pangaea, which had dominated the late Paleozoic and early Mesozoic, had already begun to fragment. The Atlantic Ocean was beginning to open, though it was still a relatively narrow seaway compared to its modern expanse. India was an island continent, slowly drifting northward on its eventual collision course with Asia. South America and Africa remained connected but were showing the first signs of the rifting that would eventually separate them. Antarctica and Australia were still joined, forming part of the great southern landmass of Gondwana. But perhaps the most significant feature of early Cretaceous geography, at least for our story, was the Tethys Sea. This vast tropical ocean stretched across much of what would become southern Europe, the Middle East, Central Asia, and Southeast Asia. Unlike the relatively shallow epicontinental seas that periodically flooded the interiors of continents, the Tethys included regions of true oceanic depth, areas where the seafloor plunged thousands of meters down into perpetual darkness. It was in these deep portions of the Tethys that Abyssosaurus made its home. The fossil beds that yielded its skeleton represent what was once a deep marine environment, far from any coastline, in waters that would have been measured in hundreds if not thousands of meters deep. The limestone in which the bones were preserved formed from the gradual accumulation of microscopic organisms, their calcium carbonate shells settling through the water column to form a fine ooze on the seafloor. The presence of certain trace fossils and the absence of shallow water indicators confirm that this was a true deep water deposit. Understanding this environment is crucial to understanding Abyssosaurus itself, because the deep ocean represents one of the most challenging habitats on Earth, demanding extreme specializations from any animal that would make it their home. The challenges are numerous and severe. First and most obviously, there is the darkness. Below approximately 200 meters, sunlight becomes insufficient for photosynthesis. By 500 meters, even the most sensitive eyes can detect only the faintest glimmer of surface light. Beyond 1,000 meters, the darkness is absolute, broken only by the bioluminescence of specialized organisms. Then there is the pressure. Every 10 meters of depth adds approximately 1 atmosphere of pressure. At depths of 1,000 meters, an animal must withstand pressures 100 times greater than at the surface. At 2,000 meters, that doubles again. Most air-breathing animals, including modern marine mammals, solve this problem through various adaptations that prevent gas spaces in their bodies from collapsing under pressure, but it remains a formidable challenge. Temperature also becomes a factor. In tropical seas like the Tethys, surface waters would have been warm, perhaps 25 to 30 degrees Celsius. But temperature drops rapidly with depth. The thermocline, the boundary layer between warm surface waters and cold deep waters, would have been crossed at relatively shallow depths, perhaps 100 to 200 meters. Below this, temperatures would have been much cooler, perhaps 10 to 15 degrees Celsius even in the tropical Tethys. Finally, there is the simple problem of finding food. The deep ocean is effectively a desert. Almost all biological productivity occurs in the sunlit surface layers where photosynthesis can take place. Some of this productivity sinks to the depths as dead organisms drift downward, creating what marine biologists call marine snow, but the amount of food energy that reaches the deep ocean is a tiny fraction of what exists in surface waters. Any predator making its living in the abyss must be extremely efficient, capable of surviving on limited and unpredictable food resources. Modern sperm whales, the largest toothed predators on Earth, have evolved an impressive suite of adaptations to meet these challenges. They possess dense bones and specialized tissues that resist pressure. They can hold their breath for up to 90 minutes, allowing them to descend to depths of over 2,000 meters. They have evolved sophisticated echolocation systems to hunt in total darkness. Their metabolism can shift into a low-energy mode during deep dives, conserving oxygen. And they specialize in hunting large, energy-rich prey like giant squid, making each successful hunt worth the tremendous energy expenditure required. The remarkable discovery made by Berezan and the researchers who followed him is that Abyssosaurus, living more than 100 million years earlier and belonging to an entirely different lineage of animals, had evolved strikingly similar solutions to these same challenges. This is convergent evolution at its most dramatic, the independent evolution of similar features in response to similar environmental pressures. Just as unrelated animals like birds, bats, and pterosaurs all evolved flight using fundamentally different anatomies, Abyssosaurus and sperm whales both evolved deep-diving predatory lifestyles using the tools available to their respective lineages. Let us begin our detailed examination of Abyssosaurus with its most distinctive feature, those enormous eyes. The eye sockets, or orbits, of Abyssosaurus are proportionally larger than those of any other known plesiosaur and indeed larger than those of most marine reptiles from any time period. In an adult individual with a skull length of approximately 80 centimeters, the eye sockets measure nearly 20 centimeters in diameter. This represents an eye-to-skull ratio comparable to that of some deep-sea fish and certain nocturnal animals. Large eyes serve one primary purpose: they gather more light. The amount of light an eye can collect is proportional to the area of the pupil, which in turn is related to the overall size of the eye. By evolving such large eyes, Abyssosaurus was maximizing its ability to detect even the faintest light sources in the deep ocean. This might include the dim downwelling light from the surface in the upper reaches of its habitat range, but more likely it was adapted to detect bioluminescence, the light produced by living organisms. Bioluminescence is common in modern deep-sea environments, where it serves various functions including communication, mate attraction, and predation. Some organisms use bioluminescent lures to attract prey. Others produce flashes of light when disturbed, either to startle predators or to attract the attention of larger predators that might prey upon their attackers. The deep waters of the Cretaceous Tethys Sea almost certainly supported bioluminescent organisms, though direct evidence is impossible to obtain since bioluminescence involves soft tissues and biochemistry that do not fossilize. For Abyssosaurus, the ability to detect bioluminescence would have been invaluable. A squid or fish moving through the dark water might disturb microscopic bioluminescent plankton, creating a faint glow that would reveal its position. A struggling prey animal might trigger bioluminescence in nearby organisms, creating a beacon visible to those enormous eyes. In the absolute darkness of the abyss, even the faintest light source becomes as obvious as a spotlight, at least to an animal equipped to see it. But large eyes alone are not sufficient for vision in near total darkness. The structure of the eye itself must be specialized. In modern deep-sea fish and some nocturnal animals, the retina is dominated by rod cells rather than cone cells. Rods are far more sensitive to light than cones but provide no color vision and relatively poor resolution. What matters in the deep is not seeing details or colors but simply detecting the presence or absence of light. While we cannot directly examine the retina of Abyssosaurus, the size and structure of its eye sockets strongly suggest a similar adaptation. Additionally, many deep-sea animals possess a structure called a tapetum lucidum, a reflective layer behind the retina that bounces light back through the photoreceptor cells, essentially giving them a second chance to capture photons. This is what causes eye shine in many animals when light hits their eyes at night. Whether Abyssosaurus possessed such a structure cannot be determined from fossils, but given the overall pattern of convergence with deep-diving modern animals, it seems likely. The placement of the eyes is also significant. In Abyssosaurus, the eye sockets are positioned more dorsally, more toward the top of the skull, than in most plesiosaurs. This suggests an animal that spent much of its time looking upward, scanning the waters above for the silhouettes of prey backlit by whatever faint light filtered down from the surface. This hunting strategy, called counter-shading detection, is used by many modern deep-sea predators. Even in near-total darkness, there is usually a subtle difference in light intensity between looking up toward the surface and looking down into the deeper abyss. A prey animal positioned above the predator will appear as a dark shape against a slightly less dark background. Moving from the eyes to the overall skull structure, we find more evidence of deep water specialization. The skull of Abyssosaurus is remarkably short and robustly built compared to typical plesiosaurs. Most plesiosaurs fell into one of two general categories: those with long, slender skulls equipped with numerous small, pointed teeth for catching fish, and those with shorter but still elongated skulls with larger, more robust teeth for tackling larger prey. Abyssosaurus fits neither pattern. Its skull is short, deep, and powerfully constructed, with a roughly triangular profile when viewed from the side. This skull shape tells us something important about how Abyssosaurus hunted. Long, slender skulls are designed for rapid movement through water, allowing an animal to dart forward and snap up quick-moving fish. The short, deep skull of Abyssosaurus was not built for this kind of pursuit hunting. Instead, it suggests an ambush predator, an animal that waited for prey to come within range and then struck with devastating power rather than prolonged speed. The teeth of Abyssosaurus support this interpretation. Rather than the numerous small teeth of fish-eaters or the regularly sized teeth of most predators, Abyssosaurus possessed a smaller number of very large, robust teeth. These teeth were not particularly sharp or blade-like. Instead, they were somewhat conical, designed to grip and hold rather than to slice and tear. The spacing between the teeth was relatively wide, and the teeth themselves showed evidence of being deeply rooted in very thick jaw bones. This dental configuration is remarkably similar to that of modern sperm whales, though of course the details differ substantially since sperm whales have teeth only in the lower jaw while Abyssosaurus had teeth in both upper and lower jaws. The functional similarity is what matters. These are teeth designed to grab large, slippery prey and hold it securely. The robust jaw structure could withstand the stresses of subduing large, struggling prey items without breaking. Analysis of the jaw mechanics reveals that Abyssosaurus had an immensely powerful bite, though perhaps not particularly fast-closing jaws. The muscle attachment sites on the skull indicate large, powerful jaw muscles oriented more for generating force than for rapid closing speed. This again points away from pursuit of small, agile fish and toward the capture and subduing of larger, slower prey. What might that prey have been? In the early Cretaceous Tethys Sea, the most likely candidates would have been cephalopods, the group that includes modern squid, octopuses, and the chambered nautilus. The Cretaceous seas were home to a tremendous diversity of cephalopods, including forms that have no modern equivalent. Some of these would have grown to considerable size, providing the kind of large, energy-rich prey package that could sustain a deep-diving predator. The similarity to modern sperm whale ecology becomes even more striking when we consider that sperm whales primarily hunt large squid, including the mysterious and rarely observed giant squid that inhabit the deep ocean. Like Abyssosaurus, sperm whales have evolved to specialize in hunting large cephalopods in deep water, and like Abyssosaurus, they possess robust teeth and powerful jaws to subdue this slippery, muscular prey. But the skull adaptations of Abyssosaurus extend beyond eyes, shape, and teeth. The internal structure of the skull bones themselves shows unusual features. The bones are notably thick and dense, lacking the internal air spaces found in many reptilian skulls. This density serves two important purposes. First, it makes the skull more resistant to the crushing pressures of the deep ocean. Second, and perhaps more importantly, it makes the skull heavy, contributing to negative buoyancy. This brings us to one of the most critical adaptations any deep-diving animal must possess: the ability to control buoyancy. For an air-breathing animal, buoyancy is a constant challenge. Air is much less dense than water, so any gas-filled space in the body creates positive buoyancy, a tendency to float upward. Modern whales solve this problem partially through the possession of very dense bones and large amounts of heavy muscle and blubber that counteract the buoyancy of their lungs. Even so, they must actively swim downward during the first part of their dives, working against their own buoyancy until they reach a depth where the compression of air in their lungs reduces its volume, and thus its buoyant effect. Abyssosaurus faced a similar challenge, though the details would have differed since it was a reptile rather than a mammal. Like all plesiosaurs, it would have needed to breathe air at the surface. Unlike modern whales, it would not have had lungs capable of collapsing and compressing to the same degree, though the exact details of plesiosaur respiratory anatomy remain uncertain since lungs do not fossilize. What is certain is that Abyssosaurus possessed extremely dense, heavy bones throughout its skeleton, not just in the skull. The postcranial skeleton, the bones of the body excluding the skull, shows evidence of a condition called pachyostosis, an extreme thickening and densification of the bones. This condition is found in some modern marine mammals, particularly slow-moving coastal species like manatees and dugongs, where it serves as ballast to help the animals stay submerged while feeding on bottom vegetation. In Abyssosaurus, the function would have been different but related, providing the negative buoyancy necessary to descend efficiently into deep water and to maintain position at depth without constantly expending energy to swim downward. The limbs of Abyssosaurus show particularly interesting modifications. Like all plesiosaurs, it possessed 4 paddle-like flippers rather than legs. These flippers were used to propel the animal through the water using a form of underwater flight, similar to how sea turtles and penguins swim. But the proportions of the Abyssosaurus flippers are unusual. They are relatively short and broad compared to those of most plesiosaurs, and the bones within them are extremely robust and dense. Short, broad flippers are not ideal for high-speed swimming. Long, narrow flippers generate more efficient thrust and allow for greater speed. But short, broad flippers excel at maneuvering and at generating powerful thrust for short bursts. For an ambush predator, the ability to accelerate rapidly from a stationary or slow-moving position would be far more valuable than sustained high-speed swimming. The flippers of Abyssosaurus suggest an animal that spent much of its time moving slowly or hovering in the water column, conserving energy, waiting for prey to approach, and then lunging forward with a powerful stroke of those broad flippers. The density of the flipper bones also contributes to overall negative buoyancy, and may have served another purpose as well. In modern diving whales and seals, the extremities are used as radiators to dump excess heat when the animals are active. Blood flowing through the flippers can release heat into the surrounding water, preventing overheating during periods of intense activity. Whether Abyssosaurus used its dense, heavily vascularized flippers for thermoregulation is speculative, but the anatomy is consistent with this possibility. The vertebral column, the backbone, of Abyssosaurus shows additional specializations for deep diving. The individual vertebrae are thick and heavy, with dense bone structure and reduced internal spaces. The neural arches, the portions of the vertebrae that protect the spinal cord, are particularly robust. This heavy vertebral construction would have served multiple purposes. Like the dense limb bones, it contributed to negative buoyancy. It also provided structural support capable of withstanding the enormous pressures encountered at depth. Additionally, the configuration of the vertebrae and their associated ribs suggests a relatively inflexible body compared to many plesiosaurs. While plesiosaurs are often depicted with long, flexible necks, the neck of Abyssosaurus was actually quite short and stiff. The vertebrae show limited range of motion, and the muscle attachment sites indicate powerful but not particularly flexible musculature. This again is consistent with an ambush hunting strategy. An animal that chases down agile prey needs a flexible body capable of rapid turns and adjustments. An animal that waits for prey to approach and then strikes with overwhelming power benefits more from a rigid, stable platform that can generate tremendous force in a single direction. The ribcage of Abyssosaurus deserves special attention. The ribs are extraordinarily thick and heavy, among the most robust known for any plesiosaur. In cross-section, they are nearly circular rather than the flattened shape typical of most ribs. This suggests they served not just to protect the internal organs but also as significant contributors to the animal's overall density, and as structural bracing against pressure. The configuration of the ribcage also provides clues about the respiratory system. The ribs are closely spaced and appear to have limited mobility, suggesting a relatively inflexible chest. This is quite different from modern marine mammals, which have highly flexible ribcages that can compress during deep dives, reducing the volume of the lungs and thus the amount of air that must be managed under pressure. If Abyssosaurus indeed had a less flexible ribcage, it suggests a different solution to the problem of diving with air-filled lungs. One possibility is that Abyssosaurus did not fully inflate its lungs before diving. Modern diving animals often exhale before or during descent, diving on partially empty lungs to reduce buoyancy and minimize the problems associated with pressure changes. The dense, heavy skeleton of Abyssosaurus would have allowed it to do this effectively, using bone density rather than lung capacity for buoyancy control. By diving on mostly empty lungs, it would have avoided many of the physiological challenges associated with deep diving while carrying large volumes of compressed air. Of course, this raises the question of how the animal obtained oxygen for these deep dives. Modern deep diving mammals solve this problem by storing large amounts of oxygen in their blood and muscles rather than in their lungs. Specialized proteins like myoglobin in muscles can bind and store oxygen at concentrations much higher than in most animals. Whether Abyssosaurus possessed similar biochemical adaptations cannot be determined from fossils, but the overall pattern of convergence with modern deep-diving animals makes it seem likely. The tail of Abyssosaurus, like its neck, was relatively short and appears to have been quite stiff. This is unusual for a plesiosaur, most of which had longer, more flexible tails. The short, stiff tail would have been less effective for rapid swimming but may have served as a stabilizer, helping the animal maintain a fixed orientation in the water column. For an ambushed predator waiting in the darkness, the ability to remain motionless, perfectly balanced in the water, would be crucial. Any unnecessary movement might alert prey or waste precious energy. Examining the overall body proportions, Abyssosaurus presents a picture quite different from the classic plesiosaur form. Where most plesiosaurs are somewhat elongated, with long necks and tails, Abyssosaurus is more compact and robust. The body is barrel-shaped, optimized more for volume and mass than for streamlining. This is not the body of a fast swimmer but of a powerful, patient hunter. Size estimates for Abyssosaurus suggest an animal approximately 6 to 7 meters in total length, with much of that length consisting of the massive trunk rather than the neck and tail. Weight estimates are more difficult, but the extreme bone density suggests this was a very heavy animal for its length, perhaps weighing 3 to 4 metric tons. For comparison, a modern great white shark of similar length might weigh 1.5 to 2 tons. The extra weight in Abyssosaurus came from those dense bones, necessary for counteracting the buoyancy of whatever air the animal carried in its lungs and perhaps in other body spaces. The second major research paper on Abyssosaurus, published in 2020, focused on biomechanical analysis and ecological interpretation. Using advanced computer modeling techniques, researchers created a three-dimensional model of the skeleton and simulated how the animal would have moved through water. These simulations confirmed what the anatomical evidence suggested: Abyssosaurus was not built for speed. Compared to other plesiosaurs of similar size, it would have been significantly slower, perhaps capable of only about half the maximum swimming speed of a typical plesiosaur. However, the simulations also revealed that Abyssosaurus was remarkably efficient at slow-speed swimming and at maintaining a fixed position in the water column. The dense body meant it could essentially drift downward with minimal effort, and the broad flippers, while not efficient for sustained swimming, could make subtle adjustments to position with minimal energy expenditure. This is exactly what we would expect for an animal that spent long periods waiting in ambush. The researchers also modeled the animal's diving capabilities, though this required making several assumptions about its physiology. Even with conservative estimates, the models suggested that Abyssosaurus could have dived to depths of at least 500 meters and possibly much deeper, perhaps to 1,000 meters or more. The dive duration would have depended on metabolic rate and oxygen storage capacity, both of which can only be estimated based on comparisons with modern animals. If Abyssosaurus had a metabolic rate similar to modern sea turtles, which are air-breathing marine reptiles and thus provide a reasonable comparison, it might have been capable of dives lasting 30 to 60 minutes. If it had evolved specialized oxygen storage systems similar to those of deep-diving mammals, dive times could have been even longer. Given the probable scarcity of prey at depth, the ability to remain submerged for extended periods would have been crucial, allowing the animal to wait patiently for hunting opportunities rather than being forced to surface frequently. The hunting strategy that emerges from this analysis is one of extreme patience and efficiency. Abyssosaurus would have descended from the surface, probably swimming actively for the first 100 meters or so until its natural negative buoyancy took over, then allowing itself to sink while making subtle adjustments with its flippers to maintain the desired orientation. Once at hunting depth, it would have hovered or drifted slowly, those enormous eyes scanning the darkness for any hint of bioluminescence, or for the faint silhouette of prey backlit by the distant surface. When prey was detected, the attack would have been sudden and overwhelming. A few powerful strokes of those broad flippers would have generated rapid acceleration over a short distance. The massive head, driven forward by the thick, powerful neck and body musculature, would have struck with tremendous force. Those robust teeth would have clamped onto the prey, and the powerful jaws would have prevented escape. For a large squid or fish, there would have been no warning and little chance of evasion once the attack began. After a successful hunt, Abyssosaurus would have faced the challenge of returning to the surface. With its lungs probably nearly empty from a long dive, and with the added weight of prey in its stomach, it would have been severely negatively buoyant. The ascent would have required considerable effort, actively swimming upward against its own weight. This energy expenditure would have been significant, another reason why each hunt needed to be successful and why the prey needed to be large enough to justify the enormous energy investment of a deep dive. The third and most recent major paper on Abyssosaurus, published in 2022, took a broader evolutionary and ecological perspective. The researchers examined where Abyssosaurus fit in the Plesiosaur family tree and what its existence tells us about the evolution of deep-water adaptations in marine reptiles. The results were fascinating and somewhat unexpected. Phylogenetic analysis, the study of evolutionary relationships, placed Abyssosaurus within a group of plesiosaurs called cryptoclitids. This was surprising because most cryptoclitids were surface-dwelling hunters with long necks and relatively gracile builds, quite different from the robust, deep-diving Abyssosaurus. The implication is that the deep-water adaptations of Abyssosaurus evolved relatively rapidly from ancestors that lived in much shallower water. This pattern of rapid adaptation to deep water is actually seen in several lineages of marine animals. Modern sperm whales, for example, evolved from much shallower diving ancestors in a period of perhaps just a few million years. The deep ocean represents a vast habitat with relatively few competitors for air-breathing predators, making it an attractive evolutionary target despite the extreme challenges it presents. Once a lineage begins to adapt to deeper water, selection can be intense, driving rapid evolution of specialized features. The paper also discussed the broader ecosystem in which Abyssosaurus lived. The Early Cretaceous Tethys Sea was home to a remarkable diversity of marine reptiles, including various plesiosaurs, ichthyosaurs, and early mosasaurs. Most of these occupied surface or mid-water habitats, hunting fish, squid, and other prey in the well-lit upper layers of the ocean. Abyssosaurus appears to have been unique in its specialization for the deep ocean, occupying a niche that none of its contemporaries exploited. This niche partitioning, the division of available resources among different species, would have reduced competition and allowed Abyssosaurus to coexist with the many other marine predators of its time. While surface-dwelling plesiosaurs competed intensely for fish and squid in shallow water, Abyssosaurus had the deep-water cephalopods largely to itself. This ecological segregation is a common pattern in diverse ecosystems, and may help explain how so many different types of marine reptiles could coexist in the Cretaceous seas. The paper also raised interesting questions about the life cycle of Abyssosaurus. All plesiosaurs were air breathers, and while their exact reproductive biology is still debated, evidence suggests that at least some species gave birth to live young rather than laying eggs. If Abyssosaurus gave birth to live young, those young would have been born at the surface, and presumably would have spent their early lives in relatively shallow water. Only as they grew would they have gradually adapted to deeper and deeper dives, their bones becoming progressively denser, their muscles developing greater oxygen storage capacity. This ontogenetic shift, the change in habitat and lifestyle as an animal matures, is common among modern marine animals. Many whales and seals have young that remain in coastal nursery areas while adults range far offshore and dive to great depths. The young of Abyssosaurus may have hunted small fish and squid in the upper water column, only gradually developing the physiological and anatomical specializations necessary for deep diving as they matured. Understanding the world of Abyssosaurus requires us to think about the deep ocean not as a barren wasteland but as a distinct ecosystem with its own rhythms and patterns. In the modern ocean, the deep sea is supported by the constant rain of organic matter from the surface, the marine snow of dead plankton, feces, and other biological debris that sinks from the productive upper layers. This creates a diffuse food base that supports a community of scavengers and small predators. But there is also a more concentrated food source in the deep, the large, mobile animals that live permanently at depth or that migrate vertically through the water column. In modern oceans, this includes various species of squid, deep-sea fish, and other organisms that have adapted to life in the darkness. These animals represent concentrated packages of energy and nutrients, and they are the primary prey of deep-diving predators like sperm whales. The Cretaceous deep ocean would have been similar. While we have few fossils from deep-water Cretaceous environments, the fossils we do have suggest a diverse community including numerous cephalopods, some fish, and probably various invertebrates. For a predator the size of Abyssosaurus, the cephalopods would have been the most attractive prey, large enough to provide a substantial energy return for the effort of hunting them. There is also the intriguing question of whether Abyssosaurus might have scavenged on occasion. In the modern deep ocean, dead whales that sink to the bottom create massive concentrations of food, supporting communities of specialized scavengers for years. If large marine reptiles or other animals died and sank in the Cretaceous seas, they would have provided similar bonanzas. The powerful jaws and robust teeth of Abyssosaurus would have been well suited to tearing flesh from large carcasses. Whether it actively sought out such food sources or simply took advantage of them when encountered remains speculative, but it is worth noting that many modern deep-sea predators are opportunistic scavengers as well as active hunters. The sensory world of Abyssosaurus would have been radically different from that of surface-dwelling animals or indeed from our own experience. Vision, mediated by those enormous eyes, would have been the primary sense for detecting prey at a distance. But once prey was located, other senses would have become important. The skull of Abyssosaurus shows well-developed areas for muscle attachment around the jaw joints, suggesting a good sense of proprioception, the awareness of jaw position and the forces being exerted. This would have been crucial for precisely controlling bite force and for maintaining grip on struggling prey. Whether Abyssosaurus possessed any kind of electroreception, the ability to detect the electrical fields generated by living organisms, is unknown. Many modern sharks and rays have this ability, as do some other fish, and it is extremely useful for hunting in dark or murky water. The soft tissue structures necessary for electroreception do not fossilize, so we cannot determine whether Abyssosaurus or any other plesiosaur possessed this sense. The convergence with deep-diving predatory strategies makes it tempting to speculate that some form of specialized sensory system existed, but this remains purely hypothetical. Hearing may also have been important. Sound travels well through water, and many modern marine animals rely heavily on acoustic signals for communication and navigation. Whether Abyssosaurus could produce sounds is unknown, but it certainly would have been able to hear, and it may have listened for the sounds made by potential prey. The relatively small ear bones preserved in the skull are similar to those of other plesiosaurs, suggesting hearing capabilities generally similar to those of its relatives, but specialized for aquatic rather than aerial sound transmission. The question of how Abyssosaurus oriented itself and navigated in the deep ocean is fascinating to consider. Modern whales can navigate across vast distances using a combination of landmarks, acoustic cues, magnetic field detection, and memory. In the perpetual darkness of the abyss, visual landmarks would have been absent, but other cues might have been available. Variations in water temperature, salinity, or chemistry might have provided information about location and depth. The very faint light from the surface would have provided a constant reference for orientation, always indicating which direction was up. It is also possible that Abyssosaurus, like some modern marine animals, possessed some form of magnetic sense, allowing it to detect the Earth's magnetic field. This would have provided a kind of internal compass, useful for maintaining direction when visual cues were absent. The biological mechanisms for magnetic sensing are still not fully understood even in modern animals, and detecting such a sense in a fossil is essentially impossible, but the potential utility of magnetic navigation for a deep-diving animal makes it an intriguing possibility. Let us consider also the daily and seasonal rhythms that might have governed the life of Abyssosaurus. In the deep ocean, traditional day-night cycles are absent. Darkness is constant, and the passage of time is not marked by the rising and setting of the sun. However, this does not mean that biological rhythms are absent. Many modern deep-sea animals maintain circadian rhythms, internal biological clocks that continue to cycle even in constant darkness. These rhythms may be synchronized by subtle cues such as changes in water chemistry, temperature, or the vertical migration of prey. Many organisms in modern oceans engage in what is called vertical migration, moving up toward the surface at night to feed and descending to deeper water during the day. This is thought to be primarily a strategy to avoid visual predators. Animals can feed in the productive surface waters under cover of darkness, then retreat to the safety of the deep during daylight hours. If similar patterns existed in the Cretaceous seas, Abyssosaurus might have timed its hunting to coincide with these migrations, positioning itself to intercept prey moving up or down through the water column. Seasonal changes might also have affected Abyssosaurus, though these effects would have been muted compared to what surface-dwelling animals experienced. In tropical and subtropical regions like the Cretaceous Tethys, seasonal temperature changes at the surface would have been relatively minor, and these changes would have been even smaller in the deep water where Abyssosaurus hunted. However, seasonal changes in surface productivity, driven by variations in nutrient availability and sunlight, could have affected the entire food web, including deep water communities. Periods of high surface productivity would have led to more organic matter sinking to the depths, potentially supporting larger populations of deep water prey species. The social behavior of Abyssosaurus is entirely unknown, but considering it provides interesting insights into the challenges of deep water life. Most plesiosaurs are thought to have been at least somewhat social, as suggested by fossil deposits containing multiple individuals. Whether this reflects true social behavior or simply aggregation at productive feeding areas is debated. For a deep-water predator like Abyssosaurus, social behavior might have been less advantageous. Food resources in the deep ocean are scarce and unpredictable. Maintaining a social group requires that there be enough food to support multiple individuals in proximity, which seems unlikely in the deep-water environment. More probably, Abyssosaurus was a solitary animal for most of its life, individual animals maintaining large home ranges that minimized competition with others of their species. They would have come together only for reproduction, perhaps gathering at traditional breeding areas in relatively shallow water. After mating, they would have dispersed again to their deep water feeding grounds. The study of Abyssosaurus has broader implications for our understanding of marine reptile evolution and ecology. It demonstrates that plesiosaurs as a group were more ecologically diverse than previously recognized, occupying not just the surface and midwater habitats where most fossils are found but also the extreme environment of the deep ocean. This suggests that our understanding of Mesozoic marine ecosystems is still incomplete, biased by the fact that deep water deposits are less common and less well studied than shallow water ones. It also raises the question of whether other lineages of marine reptiles might have produced deep water specialists that remain undiscovered. Ichthyosaurs, the dolphin-like marine reptiles that were contemporaries of plesiosaurs, are known to have achieved great diversity and included everything from small coastal species to giant open-ocean predators. Might some ichthyosaurs also have specialized for deep diving? The eye size of some ichthyosaur species suggests this possibility, but no specimens with the full suite of deep diving adaptations seen in Abyssosaurus have yet been found. Similarly, the mosasaurs, a later group of marine reptiles that dominated late Cretaceous seas after plesiosaurs and ichthyosaurs had declined, included species with various ecological specializations. Some had robust teeth suggesting durophagous diets, feeding on hard-shelled prey. Others were slender and elongated, probably fast-swimming pursuit predators. Could some have been deep divers? Again, no clear evidence exists yet, but Abyssosaurus demonstrates that this ecological niche was available to marine reptiles and could be successfully exploited. The preservation of Abyssosaurus itself is something of a minor miracle. Fossils from deep water environments are relatively rare. Most fossilization occurs in shallow water settings where sediments accumulate rapidly, and where organisms are quickly buried before scavengers and decay can destroy them. Deep water environments typically have slow sedimentation rates and lower oxygen levels, which paradoxically can both help preservation by limiting scavenger activity and hinder it by reducing the rate of burial. For Abyssosaurus to be preserved, it probably died or its carcass sank into an area of the seafloor where conditions were just right. Perhaps it died at depth and settled onto the bottom in an area of relatively rapid sediment accumulation. Or perhaps it died at the surface and sank, coming to rest in a location with low oxygen levels that limited decomposition and scavenging. The fine-grained limestone in which it was found suggests a quiet, low-energy environment, probably well below storm wave base, where the body could rest undisturbed while sediment gradually accumulated around it. Over millions of years, that sediment compacted and lithified into limestone. The bones of Abyssosaurus mineralized, the original bone material gradually being replaced by minerals from the surrounding rock while maintaining the original structure. The limestone bed that contained the fossil was part of a vast sequence of marine sediments deposited in the Tethys Sea over millions of years of the Cretaceous. Then came the tectonic forces that would eventually bring this fossil to the surface. The Tethys Sea began to close during the late Cretaceous and Cenozoic as Africa and India moved northward toward Eurasia. This massive continental collision created the alpine Himalayan mountain belt, uplifting and deforming the former seafloor. The limestone that had formed in the depths of the Tethys was thrust upward, folded, faulted, and in many places thrust up into mountain ranges. The particular limestone bed containing Abyssosaurus ended up in what is now Czechoslovakia, part of the East European platform. Unlike the intensely deformed rocks of the major mountain belts, the rocks here were only gently tilted and uplifted, preserving the fossils in relatively good condition. Erosion over millions of years gradually brought the fossil-bearing layer closer to the surface until, in 1992, human excavators finally exposed the bones that had lain hidden for 130 million years. This journey from the depths of the Tethys to a museum drawer in landlocked Russia represents one of the great cycles of Earth's geology, the constant transformation of the planet's surface through tectonics and erosion. The ocean floor becomes dry land. Mountain ranges rise and erode away. Continents drift and collide. Through all these changes, fossils are sometimes preserved, sometimes destroyed, occasionally brought to the surface where they can tell us about worlds long vanished. The scientific study of Abyssosaurus continues. New analytical techniques are constantly being developed that can extract more information from fossils. Stable isotope analysis of the bone chemistry might reveal information about the animal's diet and the temperature of the water in which it lived. CT scanning can reveal internal bone structure in unprecedented detail, potentially providing information about growth rates, metabolism, and physiology. Biomechanical simulations become more sophisticated each year, allowing ever more detailed reconstructions of how extinct animals moved and behaved. There is also hope that additional specimens might someday be found. Abyssosaurus is currently known from only a single skeleton, which limits what we can learn about variation within the species, about growth and development, and about many aspects of its biology. A second specimen, particularly if it were of a different size or from a different location, would be invaluable. Given that Abyssosaurus has been recognized as a distinct species for only a few years, it is entirely possible that other specimens exist in museum collections, misidentified or simply not yet studied in detail. The broader region where Abyssosaurus was found has produced other marine reptile fossils, suggesting that it was part of a diverse ecosystem. Some of these other fossils have not yet been fully studied. It is conceivable that further research will reveal other specialists for deep water habitats, or perhaps young individuals of Abyssosaurus that lived in shallower water. Each new find has the potential to add to our understanding of this remarkable animal and the world it inhabited. Reflecting on the discovery and study of Abyssosaurus brings us to consider the nature of paleontological research itself. Unlike many sciences that can conduct experiments and make direct observations, paleontology is fundamentally historical. We cannot observe Abyssosaurus hunting in the dark depths of the Cretaceous Ocean. We cannot measure its metabolic rate or track its movements. All we have are the bones and what we can infer from them. Yet from those bones, through careful observation, comparison, and analysis, we can reconstruct a remarkable amount of information. We can determine what this animal ate, how it moved, where it lived, and how it fit into its ecosystem. We can recognize the convergent evolution between it and modern animals, revealing the fundamental biological principles that govern adaptation to similar environmental challenges. We can place it in its evolutionary context, understanding how it relates to other plesiosaurs and how its unique features evolved. This inferential process is neither simple guesswork nor absolute certainty. It is a rigorous scientific methodology that generates testable hypotheses and builds increasingly refined models of the past. When multiple lines of evidence all point to the same conclusion, when the anatomy, the geology, the biomechanics, and the evolutionary context all tell a consistent story, we can have considerable confidence in our reconstructions. The story of Abyssosaurus also highlights the iterative nature of scientific understanding. The initial description of the species provided a first outline of its basic anatomy and ecology. The second paper refined this understanding through biomechanical analysis. The third paper placed it in a broader evolutionary and ecological context. Future research will no doubt refine the picture further, perhaps revising some current interpretations, adding new details, answering questions we have not yet thought to ask. This is not a weakness of science but one of its greatest strengths: the willingness to revise understanding in light of new evidence, the constant refinement toward more complete and accurate models of reality. For those of us fascinated by prehistoric life, Abyssosaurus offers something particularly special, a window into an aspect of the Mesozoic world that is rarely glimpsed. Most marine reptile fossils come from coastal or shallow water environments. We have abundant evidence of plesiosaurs and ichthyosaurs hunting in sunlit seas, probably not very different in their ecology from modern dolphins or sea lions. But the deep ocean, that vast dark realm that covers most of the planet, has left far fewer traces in the fossil record. Abyssosaurus gives us a rare glimpse of this hidden world, revealing that even in the Mesozoic, even before the evolution of modern whales, nature had found ways to exploit the challenging but resource-rich environment of the deep sea. There is something almost poetic about Abyssosaurus hunting in the eternal darkness, its huge eyes searching for faint glimmers of bioluminescence, its heavy body hanging suspended in the crushing pressure of the abyss, waiting with reptilian patience for prey. It is an image that challenges our typical conception of the Mesozoic seas, dominated as they are by images of sunlight and surface-dwelling monsters. It reminds us that ecosystems are complex, three-dimensional, with species occupying every available niche, from the brightest surface waters to the darkest depths. The comparison with modern sperm whales, separated from Abyssosaurus by more than 100 million years and belonging to an entirely different class of animals, provides a profound lesson in evolutionary biology. The fact that these two lineages, independently evolved such similar solutions to the challenge of deep-sea hunting demonstrates that there are predictable patterns to evolution. When faced with similar environmental challenges and opportunities, natural selection tends to produce similar adaptations, even in organisms with very different starting points. This convergent evolution is seen again and again throughout the history of life. The streamlined bodies of ichthyosaurs, sharks, and dolphins represent convergence for fast swimming. The wings of birds, bats, and pterosaurs represent convergence for flight. The specialized feeding structures of anteaters, pangolins, aardvarks, and numbats represent convergence for ant and termite eating. Each case demonstrates that while the details of how organisms solve problems may vary, the fundamental solutions often converge on similar forms. In Abyssosaurus and sperm whales, we see convergence in dense bones, powerful jaws for subduing large prey, large eyes adapted for low light, and overall body plans optimized for depth rather than speed. The fact that these similarities emerged independently, in response to the same environmental pressures, tells us something fundamental about the deep ocean as a habitat. It demands certain specific adaptations, and organisms from very different backgrounds can evolve those adaptations given sufficient time and selection pressure. As we approach the midpoint of our exploration of Abyssosaurus and its world, it is worth pausing to consider what we have learned. We have seen how a single skeleton, initially misidentified and sitting unrecognized in a museum collection for decades, eventually revealed itself to be one of the most remarkable marine reptiles yet discovered. We have examined its anatomy in detail, from the enormous eyes to the dense bones to the powerful jaws, each feature telling us something about how this animal lived. We have reconstructed its hunting strategy as an ambush predator of the deep ocean, waiting in darkness for large prey to approach. We have placed it in its environmental context, the Early Cretaceous Tethys Sea, and in its evolutionary context, as an unusual offshoot of the cryptoclidid plesiosaurs. We have marveled at the convergence between this Cretaceous reptile and modern whales, so different in their origins yet so similar in their adaptations. But there is much more to explore. In the continuation of our journey, we will delve deeper into the world of the early Cretaceous, examining the other organisms that shared the seas with Abyssosaurus, the geological processes that shaped its environment and eventually preserved its remains, and the modern scientific techniques that have allowed us to extract so much information from these ancient bones. We will consider what Abyssosaurus tells us about the evolution of the oceans and about the persistence of deep-water ecosystems across hundreds of millions of years. We will reflect on the fragility of the fossil record and the remarkable good fortune that has allowed this single specimen to survive and eventually reveal its secrets to us. The story of Abyssosaurus is far from complete. It is a story still being written by researchers working in laboratories and museums around the world, applying new techniques, asking new questions, gradually filling in the gaps in our understanding. It is a story that connects us to a vanished world, a time when the continents wore different shapes, when the oceans teemed with reptilian predators rather than mammalian ones, when creatures we can barely imagine prowled the depths of seas that no longer exist. And it is a story that reminds us of the power of patient, careful scientific investigation to reveal the past, to bring long-extinct creatures back to life, if only in our imaginations and our models and our reconstructions. Every fossil is a messenger from deep time, and Abyssosaurus, that wondrous lizard of the abyss, carries a message about the incredible adaptability of life, the constancy of ecological principles across vast spans of time, and the enduring mysteries that still await discovery in the rocks beneath our feet. This concludes Part 1 of our exploration of Abyssosaurus. In Part 2, we will continue our journey, examining the broader ecosystem of the Cretaceous Tethys, the geological processes that preserved and eventually revealed this remarkable fossil, the modern analytical techniques that have unlocked its secrets, and the ongoing research that continues to refine our understanding of this deep-dwelling predator from the ancient seas. The story of the phantom predator of the abyss continues, reaching back through time to illuminate not just one remarkable species but the entire history of life's conquest of Earth's oceans.